My sister rose to her feet at our Thanksgiving table, lifted her crystal glass high, and proudly announced that our father had secretly signed over to her the multi-million-dollar company I had built from absolutely nothing. She smiled directly at me, savoring every second of the moment, and declared, almost gleefully, that I was getting absolutely nothing in return. The entire room went dead silent. I did not scream. I did not cry. I simply took a slow, unhurried sip of my vodka, looked directly at my father, who suddenly found it very hard to meet my eyes, and asked, "Should I tell them now, or would you like to do the honors yourself?" My name is Sienna. I am 33 years old, and I am the founder of a high-end organic cosmetics brand. Before I continue this story, let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to outsmart toxic family members who tried to profit off of your hard work. Growing up, I was always the scapegoat, the daughter whose achievements were either quietly ignored or loudly claimed by someone else. But I learned early on that the best revenge is never an emotional argument. It is an airtight legal strategy, built quietly, patiently, and long before anyone else even realizes the game has started. I hosted Thanksgiving dinner this year at my sprawling estate in the Hamptons. The house is a beautiful stone property with soaring cathedral ceilings, a massive chef's kitchen, and a formal dining room that looks straight out over the ocean. My family has always simply assumed I rent this place, that I split the cost with roommates just to scrape together the monthly lease. They never once bothered to ask for the truth, and I never bothered to volunteer it. It fit their narrative far too perfectly to imagine me quietly struggling. To them, I was still just the stubborn older sister who made lip gloss and lotion in her kitchen, barely getting by. They had absolutely no idea that I had bought this $3 million property entirely in cash 2 years earlier, safely tucked away inside a private trust. The long mahogany dining table was covered in fine china and silver platters of roasted turkey, artisan stuffing, and expensive wine I had personally selected and paid for. The warm glow from the crystal chandelier made the room feel cozy and intimate, but the energy circling that table was something else entirely. My younger sister Amber, 30 years old, sat directly across from me. Amber is, and has always been, the golden child. Entitled, materialistic, and constantly bailed out by our parents whenever she maxes out yet another credit card. Beside her sat her husband, Trey, a 34-year-old man who confidently, loudly, calls himself a finance expert. In reality, Trey had recently bankrupted his own cryptocurrency fund and had been desperately hunting for a new cash cow to bankroll his increasingly lavish lifestyle. My parents, Richard and Diane, sat at opposite ends of the table. My mother, Diane, was already misty-eyed with pride just from looking at Amber, while my father, Richard, puffed his chest out with that same familiar, manipulative authority he had carried my entire life. We had just finished the main course when Amber picked up her heavy silver spoon and began tapping it lightly against her champagne flute. The sharp, ringing clink cut straight through the soft jazz playing in the background. Everyone stopped eating and turned toward her. Amber rose slowly, smoothing down her expensive silk maternity dress, and looked around the table, soaking in the attention she so clearly craved, before her eyes finally settled on mine. Her expression was a strange mixture of fake pity and pure, smug triumph. She announced that she had a massive, life-changing surprise to share with the whole family. In a sickeningly sweet voice, Amber declared that our father, Richard, had just finalized some very important legal paperwork. She reached into her designer bag, pulled out a thick manila envelope, and proudly proclaimed that he had legally transferred 100% ownership of Sienna Botanicals, LLC, into her name and Trey's name. She called it an early Christmas gift from Dad, A generous way, she said, to support their upcoming baby and secure their family's financial future forever. Trey leaned back in his leather chair, unbuttoning his tailored suit jacket with a smirk that made my stomach turn. He crossed his arms and looked at me the way you'd look at an employee who had just been quietly dismissed. He puffed his chest out and loudly added that they were absolutely thrilled to finally take the reins of the business. He actually had the nerve to announce that, under his brilliant financial management, they were going to transform my little hobby into a real corporate empire. My mother gasped in absolute delight, clapping her hands together. She reached over to squeeze Amber's hand, gushing about how much she deserved this incredible blessing. My father just sat there, swirling his wine glass, looking thoroughly pleased with himself, acting like some generous king who had just bestowed a kingdom upon his favorite heir. None of them seemed to care, even slightly, that the kingdom they were celebrating had been built entirely from my blood, sweat, and years of exhausted tears. They sat in my own home, drinking my wine, celebrating the brazen theft of my life's work directly to my face. They genuinely believed they had already won. I silently studied Trey. He was practically vibrating with unearned confidence. He took another sip of wine, swirled it dramatically, and set the glass down with a heavy thud. He actually had the audacity to adjust his tie and clear his throat, commanding the room as though he were opening a speech at a shareholder meeting. "Look, Sienna," Trey said, his tone dripping with condescension. "We know this is a big transition for you. You've been running the day-to-day operations, and we genuinely appreciate the groundwork you laid. But let's be honest with each other. You just don't have the vision to scale something like this. You're thinking small boutiques, local pop-ups. I'm thinking global distribution. I have the network to take Sienna Botanicals public within 2 years." I simply stared at him. The man who had recently lost his investors millions of dollars in a collapsing crypto scheme was now lecturing me, in my own dining room, about global distribution strategy. Trey kept pacing behind Amber's chair, resting both hands on her shoulders. "We value loyalty," he continued smoothly. "Amber and I talked it over, and we're willing to keep you on payroll. We need someone around who knows the inventory system. If you're willing to learn your place and respect the new chain of command, we can offer you a position as warehouse manager. You'd get a stable salary, decent benefits, and you'd never again have to worry about the heavy burden of actual decision-making." Amber chimed in eagerly, nodding along. "It's a genuinely generous offer, Sienna. You really should take it. You've always preferred working behind the scenes anyway." The sheer delusion sitting at that table was suffocating. They were offering me a demotion inside my own company, a business generating tens of millions of dollars a year in revenue, as if they were tossing a starving dog a single bone. I finally broke my silence. I set my napkin down flat on the table and kept my voice perfectly level. "A warehouse manager. How thoughtful of you, Trey. But I think there's a slight misunderstanding here about how ownership actually works. You cannot simply gift a company the way you'd gift a sweater. I built Sienna Botanicals. My name is on the brand." My father slammed his open palm flat against the dining table, hard enough to rattle the silverware. His face flushed red, and the polite mask he'd worn all evening dropped instantly, revealing the aggressive, domineering man I had known my entire life. "Don't play dumb with me, young lady," Richard snapped, jabbing a thick finger in my direction. "You know exactly how that paperwork was filed. You were 17 years old when you started mixing those little potions in the kitchen. 17, a minor. You couldn't legally open a commercial bank account. You couldn't legally sign a binding vendor contract. So who exactly do you think signed all of those initial incorporation documents?" "I did." He leaned forward, his eyes narrowing with that toxic mixture of pride and resentment I knew so well. "I was listed as the legal custodian and the primary owner of the limited liability company. It was my name on the line. And let's not forget where the money came from to buy your very first batch of bulk ingredients and packaging. I gave you $5,000 straight out of the family savings account. I funded your entire little startup. You gave me $5,000, which I paid back in full, with interest, within 6 months. I replied calmly, never once breaking eye contact. And I did every bit of the actual work. The formulas, the branding, the endless late nights packing boxes on my living room floor. Paying you back doesn't change the underlying equity structure. Seed capital is seed capital, Richard countered, his voice booming through the entire dining room. Without my money and my signature, you'd have had nothing at all. By the letter of the law, Sienna Botanicals LLC belongs to me. It has always belonged to me. I let you run it because it kept you busy, but it is legally my asset. And as the legal owner, I have every right to transfer my asset to whomever I choose. He gestured broadly toward Amber and Trey. Your sister is bringing a child into this world. She needs stability. Trey is finally ready to step up and lead a real enterprise. You've been hoarding all the profits for yourself for years, living in this ridiculous, wildly overpriced rental, refusing to lift a finger to help your own blood. Well, I'm correcting that mistake tonight. The company is theirs now. The paperwork is already filed with the state. It is legally done. The dining room fell completely silent once again. My own mother looked away, suddenly fascinated by her wineglass, while Amber and Trey practically glowed with triumph. They truly believed that my father's signature on some dusty 15-year-old document handed them the keys to my entire kingdom. They were convinced the trap had already closed around me, with absolutely no idea that I was the one who had quietly built that cage myself, brick by brick, years in advance. I watched my father lean back in his chair, arms crossed, looking every bit like a judge who had just delivered a final, undeniable verdict, visibly proud of the ambush he'd so carefully orchestrated. Before I could even respond to his little legal threats, my mother decided it was the perfect time to play her favorite role, the peacemaker who somehow always managed to make me the villain of the story. Diane dramatically dabbed at her perfectly dry eyes with a linen napkin and reached across the table, her voice trembling with entirely forced emotion. Sienna, sweetheart, please try to understand where we're coming from, she pleaded, wearing an expression of deep, theatrical sorrow. We're family. You've always been the strong one, the independent one. You just need to be the bigger person right now. Amber is pregnant. She's bringing our very first grandchild into this world, and she's been under so much terrible stress lately. My mother let out a heavy, performative sigh and shifted her gaze toward Trey, completely ignoring the sharp glare he was shooting her way. Trey has had such a terrible run of bad luck, Diane went on, dropping her voice to a theatrical whisper, as though she were confessing some tragic secret. That cryptocurrency fund he was managing collapsed completely last month. They lost absolutely everything. Their savings are entirely wiped out. They're drowning, Sienna. They desperately need this company's revenue just to survive and keep a roof over their heads. Trey's face instantly hardened, his arrogant facade slipping for one brief, unguarded second. His jaw clenched tight as he shifted uncomfortably in his seat. It was unexpected market volatility, Diane, he snapped, clearly humiliated to have his financial failure weaponized as a charity case. I did not lose everything. It's a temporary liquidity issue. I'm simply pivoting my portfolio toward a more stable asset class, like retail cosmetics. I looked from Trey to my mother, feeling a cold, calm clarity settle over me. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't match their emotional chaos. I simply let the silence stretch a little longer, forcing them all to sit in the pathetic reality of their own words. Let me make sure I understand this correctly, I said, my voice cutting clean through the tension like glass. Because Trey gambled away his investors' money on a failed crypto scheme, I'm now supposed to hand over the business I built from absolute scratch, so it can act as a financial life raft for a man who just insulted me in my own dining room? My mother gasped, clutching her chest as if I had physically struck her. How can you be so incredibly cold? We are talking about your sister's future. Let's talk about the past 15 years instead, Mom. I fired back, leaning forward slightly. Let's talk about what family support actually looks like inside this house. I have not taken a single dime from either of you since the day I turned 18. Not 1 cent. I have worked 80-hour weeks for over a decade straight. I missed holidays. I missed vacations. I slept on cold concrete warehouse floors just to make sure my holiday orders shipped on time. I built every ounce of my success through relentless, exhausting, unglamorous discipline. I turned my gaze toward Amber, who was aggressively stabbing at a piece of turkey with her fork, refusing to meet my eyes. Meanwhile, I continued, you and Dad paid for Amber to drop out of 3 different private colleges because she simply couldn't decide on a major. When she wanted to launch her failed jewelry line, Dad wrote the check without a second thought. And just last year, you handed her a $100,000 down payment for her house. You have bankrolled her entire existence from day one, and now you want to hand her mine too. Amber finally snapped her head up, her face flushed with anger. It is completely different and you know it. I was trying to find myself. You always knew exactly what you wanted to do. It has always been so easy for you. Easy, I repeated, nearly laughing at the sheer absurdity of the word. You think waking up at 4 in the morning to negotiate with overseas suppliers is easy? You think risking absolutely everything I had again and again is easy? Diane reached out once more, her voice slipping into that sickly sweet tone reserved for disappointed parents everywhere. Family sacrifices for each other, Sienna. Look around you. You are already so successful. You have this beautiful rental home. You clearly have plenty of money to spare. Why must you be so incredibly selfish when your own sister is in need? Why can't you just be happy for her? I looked around the table at all 4 of them. The manufactured tears, the guilt trips, the constant, exhausting expectation that I must shrink my entire life so Amber could comfortably expand hers. It was the exact same toxic dynamic they had forced onto me since early childhood. But this time, I was not a helpless teenager desperate for their approval. I was a grown woman holding every single card at the table. I let the heavy silence linger a few seconds longer, watching my family exchange confused, uncertain glances. They were waiting for me to break down. They fully expected me to yell, to throw my linen napkin down, to storm out of my own dining room in a fit of hysterical tears. That version of me, that was the old Sienna, the teenage girl who used to beg desperately for their approval. But as I sat there, watching my father's smug expression and Trey's arrogant posture, I felt absolutely nothing but a cold, deliberate calm. I reached for my water glass, took a slow sip, and set it carefully back down on its coaster. Then I turned my full attention to Trey. He shifted his weight, trying hard to maintain his intimidating stance, but I could catch a brief flicker of uncertainty flash across his eyes. "So, Trey," I said, my voice smooth and entirely professional, stripping away every last trace of our toxic family dynamic. "Since you're stepping in as the new owner and chief executive of Sienna Botanicals, I assume you've already done your due diligence. As a finance expert, surely you conducted a thorough review of the company's records before allowing my father to transfer the liability into your name." Trey scoffed, rolling his shoulders defensively. "I've reviewed enough to know the margins are solid. It's a retail product line. Buy low, sell high. It's not rocket science, Sienna." "I see," I replied, folding my hands neatly on the table in front of me. "But have you actually reviewed the profit and loss statements from the last 3 quarters? Have you looked at the P&L closely enough to understand our operational burn rate? What about our supply chain logistics? Do you know the lead times for sourcing raw organic materials from our international vendors? Or the strict penalty clauses written into our fulfillment contracts if we miss even a single shipping deadline? Amber rolled her eyes dramatically and let out a loud groan. Oh my God, Sienna. Stop trying to use big fancy business words to scare him. Trey has managed millions of dollars for high-level clients. Your little lotion company is absolutely nothing compared to what he's used to handling on a daily basis. Trey held up a hand, playing the magnanimous leader gently calming his wife, and looked down at me with a pitying little smile. Exactly the kind of condescending smile you'd give a child who thinks they've done something impressive. Amber's right, Trey chuckled, leaning his hip lazily against the edge of the dining table. You are seriously overcomplicating this just to make yourself feel indispensable. Let's be brutally honest here. Running a modern makeup brand isn't some complex logistical puzzle. It's basically posting aesthetic photos on Instagram, paying a handful of influencers to pretend they like it, and cashing the checks that roll in. The warehouse packs the boxes, the website processes the payments, and the money just flows. I'll have your whole bloated operation streamlined within a week. I stared at him. I genuinely stared at a man with zero real understanding of manufacturing, zero understanding of international freight, and zero understanding of commercial liability, confidently lecturing me about my own industry. It was honestly breathtaking to witness up close. His arrogance wasn't just offensive, it was, in fact, his single greatest vulnerability. He hadn't looked at a single financial document. He had simply, blindly signed whatever paperwork my father slid in front of him, completely blinded by the promise of easy money and the sheer thrill of stealing from me. My father chimed back in, pounding the table lightly with his fist to regain control of the room. Enough talking. You heard the boy. This transition is happening tonight. You can either cooperate and hand over the administrative access smoothly, or we can do this the hard way, with lawyers. But I promise you, Sienna, you will lose. The law is entirely on my side. A slow, genuine smile spread across my face. It was, in fact, the very first time I had smiled all evening. My mother looked slightly unnerved by it, shifting uncomfortably in her chair and trading a worried glance with Amber. Lawyers won't be necessary, Dad, I said cheerfully. I reached down into my leather tote bag resting beside my chair and pulled out my iPad Pro. I woke the screen, tapped into my administrative dashboard, and pulled up the digital handover protocols. I laid the tablet flat on the table and slid it smoothly across the polished wood until it stopped directly in front of Trey. You're absolutely right, I said, my tone bright and thoroughly accommodating. Why fight it? You clearly have a brilliant vision for this brand. Trey, Dad, since you're the legal custodian who originally funded the $5,000, it's only fair that you exercise your rights properly. I pulled a digital stylus from the magnetic edge of the case and held it out toward Trey. Here's the master access portal, I said, pointing at the screen. If you sign right there, on the digital line, it immediately transfers the primary banking authorizations, the vendor communication portals, and every liability acknowledgement directly to your email address. I'll sign my formal resignation right underneath it. You can have absolutely all of it, right now. The entire room went completely paralyzed. My mother's mouth fell open. Amber blinked rapidly, glancing back and forth between me and the iPad as though it might spring open like a trapdoor. Even my father looked momentarily stunned by how easily I appeared to be capitulating. He had braced himself for a massive screaming match, a brutal legal battle, some desperate, tearful plea for mercy. He had never once prepared for the possibility that I would simply, calmly, hand over the keys to the kingdom. Trey, however, was far too blinded by his own enormous ego to sense any danger at all. He grinned widely and snatched the stylus straight out of my hand. "Smart girl," he muttered quickly, scribbling his digital signature across the screen. "Glad to see you finally understand your place." He hit the bright green confirm button with a flourish. I smiled even wider. The trap was officially, quietly locked shut. The moment the confirmation screen flashed green, Trey tossed the stylus back onto the table as though he had just closed some massive corporate acquisition. He immediately pulled his phone from his pocket, his thumbs flying across the screen as he prepared to seize absolute control. He didn't waste a single second pretending to be gracious about any of it. "Right," Trey said, snapping his fingers in my direction to grab my attention. "I need the master administrative passwords immediately. I want full access to the primary banking portals, the e-commerce dashboard, and the complete directory of our international vendor contacts. Send me the encrypted file with the raw material suppliers and the logistics routing numbers. I need to see our exact profit margins before the markets open on Monday." I nodded smoothly and pulled the iPad back toward me. I opened the security settings and began typing his email address directly into the primary ownership field. Amber clapped her hands together, practically bouncing in her seat with excitement. She leaned against Trey, resting her chin on his arm. "How much is sitting in the operating account right now, Trey?" she asked, her eyes wide with naked greed. "We should pull a dividend out right away. We need to upgrade my car before the baby arrives, and we absolutely need to book that trip to St. Bart's to celebrate our new acquisition." Trey wrapped an arm around her waist and kissed the side of her head. "Think bigger, baby," he bragged, his voice booming clear across my dining room. "We're not just buying cars here. With my financial network, I'm taking Sienna Botanicals public within the year. We'll initiate a reverse merger or maybe launch a full IPO. Once we push the valuation up, we're buying a yacht. Not some little boat. A real vessel. We'll dock it in Miami by next winter and host investor parties right on the deck." I listened to his ridiculous fantasy while systematically, quietly revoking my own access. I watched the progress bar fill up on my screen as I transferred the digital keys over to a man who had absolutely no idea what he was actually unlocking. I confirmed the transfer of the limited liability company's banking portal. I transferred the designated contact information for the state tax board. I even forwarded the automated notification emails straight to his personal account. "All done," I said, pushing the iPad gently away. "You should be receiving the authentication emails right about now. You're officially the primary administrator of Sienna Botanicals, LLC." Trey looked down at his phone as a barrage of new emails came flooding into his inbox. He scrolled through them, a look of pure, unfiltered satisfaction washing across his face. He actually laughed out loud, a harsh, arrogant sound that echoed off the cathedral ceilings above us. Richard beamed with overwhelming pride. He raised his wineglass high into the air, chest puffed out, looking at Trey and Amber as though they were the single greatest achievement of his entire life. "Now that," Richard announced proudly, "is how you execute a real business deal." A toast to Amber and Trey, the true business minds of this family. "I always knew you two had the ruthless corporate instinct it takes to survive out there in the real world. Sienna did a fine little job getting the project off the ground, but it takes true visionaries to build a real empire. I couldn't be prouder to pass the torch to people who genuinely understand the value of a dollar." Diane eagerly raised her glass to join the toast, then turned to me with a sickeningly sweet smile of false sympathy. "Don't feel bad, Sienna," she said softly. "You're a wonderful little artisan. You make lovely lotions. But the business world is simply too harsh and complicated for someone with your quiet personality. You should honestly feel relieved that Trey is taking this heavy burden off your shoulders. Now you can finally relax and enjoy a simple life." I didn't argue. I simply reached across the table, picked up the thick manila envelope my father had brought, and pulled out the physical documents inside. I uncapped my pen and signed my name across the formal resignation letter, relinquishing all of my duties as an officer of the limited liability company. I signed the liability transfer waivers. I signed the banking authorization releases. Then I handed the entire stack of perfectly executed legal documents directly back to my father. Richard snatched the papers from my hand, quickly scanning every signature line to make sure I hadn't skipped a single one. Satisfied, he slid the whole stack over to Trey, giving his son-in-law a firm, approving nod. The handover was complete. They now had absolutely everything they had demanded: the paperwork, the bank access, the title. They were completely convinced they had just struck gold. They had no idea whatsoever that they had just willingly chained themselves to a sinking ship. With the documents now securely in Trey's possession, the atmosphere in the dining room shifted quickly from tense negotiation to full-blown, arrogant celebration. Amber leaned back in her chair, hands resting on her pregnant belly, and let out a long, theatrical sigh of relief. She looked around my dining room, her eyes sweeping across the vaulted ceilings, the custom artwork, and the expensive hardwood floors, with a look of thinly disguised disdain. "Sienna, we really need to talk about your living situation now," Amber said, her voice dripping with that fake maternal concern she'd spent years perfecting. "Now that you've formally resigned and have absolutely no income, you obviously can't afford to keep the lease on this massive, overpriced rental. It was always a ridiculous financial decision anyway, trying to live all the way out here in the Hamptons just to look successful to your little internet friends." I calmly picked up my fork and took a small bite of my artisan stuffing, letting her talk. I wanted her to put every last ounce of her entitlement on full, glorious display. "Trey and I were actually discussing it on the drive over here," Amber continued, completely oblivious to my silence. "Since we're about to be so incredibly busy running the company and preparing for the public offering, we're going to need some reliable help at home. We have a finished basement in our house. It's not huge, and it can get a little drafty in the winter, but it does have its own small bathroom. We're willing to let you move in there, rent-free." Trey nodded enthusiastically, pointing his wine glass at me. "It's a win for everyone. Sienna, you get a free place to crash while you figure out your next minimum wage job. And in exchange, you can be our full-time live-in nanny. Amber's going to need round-the-clock support once the baby arrives, and honestly, we just can't trust strangers with that. You'll be responsible for the night feeds, the laundry, keeping the house pristine. Plus, it'll be genuinely good for you to finally learn some domestic skills instead of pretending to be a corporate executive. You've been playing businesswoman for far too long. It's time you rejoined the real world." I sat perfectly still, my face a carefully constructed mask of polite interest. My younger sister, whose mortgage had been heavily subsidized by my father, and her husband, who had just bankrupted the only legitimate business venture he'd ever attempted, were offering me a damp basement to live in. They genuinely, sincerely believed they were doing me an enormous favor by allowing me to become their unpaid live-in servant. It was the ultimate perfect expression of exactly how they had always viewed me, not as a person, not as a successful entrepreneur, but as a resource to be quietly consumed and discarded whenever it happened to be convenient. My mother clasped her hands together, eyes shining with unshed tears of joy. "Oh, Amber, that is so incredibly generous of you," Diane gushed, reaching over to pat my sister's arm. "Do you see, Sienna? This is what real family does. We take care of each other. You've been so isolated and stressed out here all by yourself, prioritizing your selfish little career over everything that actually matters. Moving into the basement will give you a real sense of purpose. You can help raise your niece or nephew, and you won't have to worry any longer about paying rent or buying your own groceries. You can finally experience the joy of family life you've been missing out on for so long." I looked down at the expensive china plate in front of me and took a deep, slow breath to hold my composure. It was almost beautiful, in a twisted way, how perfectly they had constructed this entire alternate reality. They had just stolen my life's work, stripped away my supposed income, and yet had somehow convinced themselves that they were my benevolent saviors. My father, entirely satisfied that he had finally restored the natural order of the family, stood up at the head of the table. He grabbed the heavy silver carving knife and the serving fork, driving the prongs deep into the center of the roasted turkey. He began slicing thick pieces of the premium organic bird I had specially ordered from a local farm, distributing the meat onto their plates with the grand, sweeping gestures of a victorious patriarch. He spooned generous heaps of artisan stuffing and poured rich gravy over their portions, acting exactly like the gracious host of a feast he'd had absolutely no hand in creating. "Let us eat and celebrate," Richard announced, his voice booming with total authority. "To new beginnings, to smart business moves, and to keeping the family wealth exactly where it belongs." They all raised their glasses and clinked them together in a unified cheer that deliberately, pointedly excluded me. I watched them dig eagerly into the luxurious Thanksgiving feast I had personally prepared and paid for. I watched them pour still more of my expensive vintage wine into their crystal glasses, laughing loudly, making grand plans for the millions of dollars they were absolutely convinced they were about to inherit. Amber was already scrolling through her phone, casually mentioning different luxury yacht models she wanted Trey to look into. As I sat there quietly sipping my water, my inner monologue was completely devoid of anger, panic, or resentment. I felt no urge whatsoever to defend my home, my accomplishments, or my bank account. Instead, I simply observed them, like a scientist watching a fascinating slow-motion disaster unfold in real time. Every bite of food they took, every arrogant boast they made, was just another heavy chain binding them more tightly to their own destruction. They were gleefully celebrating their own absolute ruin, completely oblivious to the massive legal landmine they had just willingly strapped to their own chests. The digital ink on those handover documents was already dry. The countdown to their financial devastation had officially begun, and all I had to do now was sit back, watch them eat my turkey, and quietly wait for the clock to run out. I rested my elbows on the table and interlaced my fingers, watching Trey aggressively slice through another piece of white meat. The dining room filled with the clink of silverware, and my mother's happy humming along to the jazz music. Since they were all so eager to play corporate executives, I decided this was the perfect moment to ask a few basic operational questions, just to see how deep the delusion truly ran. I looked directly at Trey, keeping my expression perfectly pleasant, and asked him how exactly he planned to handle our fourth quarter Sephora fulfillment. Trey stopped chewing mid-bite. He glanced at me, and a brief flash of confusion crossed his features before his arrogant mask slid smoothly back into place. He swallowed loudly and wiped his mouth with his linen napkin. "The Sephora fulfillment," I clarified, speaking slowly as though addressing a small child. "Our holiday purchase orders are massive this year. Our main warehouse facility needs to ship out 40,000 units of the organic night serum by next Friday. The raw ingredients are highly volatile and require temperature-controlled logistics the entire way. If we miss the delivery window by even 24 hours, the retailer imposes a 15% penalty on the entire invoice. Have you already coordinated with the freight forwarders?" Trey let out a loud, dismissive laugh, waving his hand through the air. He leaned back in his chair, radiating a false, hollow sense of supreme confidence. "Please, Sienna," he scoffed, "don't try to overwhelm me with all your little administrative details. You're acting like moving a few boxes of face cream is some kind of full-scale military operation." He looked around the table, making sure he had a full audience before launching back into his grandstanding. I have high-level finance connections all up and down the East Coast, Trey bragged, tapping his temple for emphasis. I know guys who move international cargo shipments worth tens of millions of dollars without blinking. I'll just make one quick phone call Monday morning and have one of my supply chain specialists handle your little warehouse issue personally. It's a simple logistical pivot, honestly. We'll probably even cut costs by outsourcing the packaging to a cheaper facility altogether. You've clearly been overpaying for temperature control this whole time anyway. Amber nodded along, completely mesmerized by his string of corporate buzzwords. Exactly, she added, taking a delicate sip of her sparkling water. You always have to make things so unnecessarily complicated, Sienna. Trey knows how to delegate. That's what real leaders do. They don't stress over boxes. I didn't bother correcting him. I didn't bother explaining that our organic certifications would be instantly revoked the moment he moved production to some cheaper, non-compliant facility. I simply let his ignorance hang there in the air, a quiet testament to his impending doom. Instead, I shifted my gaze down the table toward my father. Richard was happily buttering a dinner roll, looking thoroughly relaxed now that he believed he had successfully dumped the company off on someone else. Dad, I said, keeping my voice low and serious. Are you absolutely certain Trey is ready for this? Richard paused, his butter knife hovering above his plate. He shot me a warning glare. I just told you he is, Sienna. Drop it. I'm not talking about the day-to-day operations. I pressed gently, making sure my words carried clearly enough for the entire table to hear. I'm talking about the legal and financial burden. Running an enterprise isn't just about collecting revenue. It's about absorbing the risk. When you transferred the LLC to Trey and Amber, you also transferred every single one of its legal obligations along with it. I just want to be sure you've fully prepared them for the liabilities that come attached to this. I emphasized the word liabilities just enough to catch a brief, panicked twitch in my father's right eye. For a split second, the smugness vanished entirely from his face, replaced by the sheer terror of a man who knew exactly what he was hiding. He quickly looked down at his plate, refusing to meet my eyes, then slammed the butter knife down against the porcelain with a sharp, jarring clack. He pointed a finger directly at my face, his voice suddenly rising in anger. Listen to me very carefully, Richard snarled, dropping the benevolent patriarch act entirely. I am sick and tired of your endless jealousy. You cannot stand the fact that your sister is finally stepping up to take your place. You cannot stand that a real businessman like Trey is going to take this company to heights you could never have reached. He leaned forward, his face flushed deep red. There are no liabilities that Trey can't handle. He's a financial professional. You're just trying to ruin this celebration because you're bitter. You've always been bitter, Sienna. You were a difficult child, and you're a difficult adult. Now sit there, finish your meal, and stop trying to undermine your sister's happiness with your pathetic little scare tactics. My mother quickly chimed in, glaring at me with deep, exaggerated disappointment. Really, Sienna? Diane scolded. Can you not just let Amber have this one special night? Must you always try to be the smartest person in the room? I held both hands up in a small gesture of surrender, my face entirely neutral. I leaned back in my chair and picked up my glass of water. You're right, I said smoothly. I apologize. I won't mention the liabilities again. I took a slow sip of my drink, my eyes flicking briefly to the digital clock resting on the mantelpiece across the room. It read exactly 6:55. I only had to endure 5 more minutes of their insults before the automated banking system would deliver the reality check they so richly deserved. Let them enjoy their turkey a little longer. The main course, in every sense, was about to be served. My mother wiped a small smudge of cranberry sauce from the corner of her mouth with her linen napkin and tapped a manicured fingernail against her crystal wine glass. The sharp, high-pitched ring demanded the attention of the entire table. Diane rose slowly, smoothing the front of her expensive cashmere sweater. She lifted her glass high, her eyes practically shining with overwhelming adoration as she looked down at Amber and Trey. "I want to propose a formal toast," Diane announced, her voice trembling slightly with manufactured emotion. "To my beautiful daughter Amber, who is going to be the most incredible mother. And to Trey, the brilliant new chief executive officer of our family's empire." My father grunted his hearty approval, immediately raising his own glass. "Hear, hear," Diane continued, pacing the length of the table with the theatrical flourish of a woman who genuinely believed she was starring in her own movie. "For years, we have worried about the true potential of this little business. We watched it stay stagnant, trapped inside a small mindset, desperately waiting for someone with real vision and real corporate expertise to finally take the helm. Today, that long wait is finally over. Trey, we are so incredibly blessed to have your financial genius leading the way now. And Amber, my sweet girl, you finally have the wealthy, stable future you have always, always deserved. To the new owners of Sienna Botanicals, may your success bring this entire family the prestige it has always been meant to achieve." "To the new owners," Trey echoed proudly, clinking his glass against Amber's. They all took a long, celebratory drink. Not a single one of them so much as glanced in my direction. It was as though I had physically evaporated from the room the very moment my father handed over those signed documents. The shift in their behavior was instantaneous and painfully revealing. Now that they believed they had stripped me of my only valuable asset, I was no longer a threat. I was no longer an obstacle worth acknowledging. I was simply the hired help, quietly occupying space at the edge of their grand celebration. Amber set her glass down and snapped her fingers in my direction without even bothering to turn her head. "Sienna," she said, her tone flat and utterly dismissive. "Be useful and clear these appetizer plates, would you? And bring out the second bottle of the Bordeaux. Trey and I want to celebrate properly before we start outlining our executive strategy for Monday morning." I didn't argue. I didn't throw my plate against the wall. I simply stood up calmly, gathered their dirty salad plates, and stacked them neatly along my arm. I walked over to the mahogany credenza, retrieved the second bottle of the expensive red wine I had personally purchased, and smoothly uncorked it. I carried it back to the table and poured generous measures into my parents' glasses, then filled Trey and Amber's glasses right up to the brim. "Thank you," Diane murmured dismissively, not even bothering to make eye contact, already fully absorbed in a conversation with Richard about which country club Trey should join now that he was, in their minds, a wealthy executive. I returned to my seat and simply watched them. The dining room was loud with their arrogant laughter and increasingly ridiculous fantasies. Trey was busy explaining to my father, in great detail, how he planned to leverage the company's inventory to secure a massive line of credit for his next real estate venture. Amber was showing my mother photos of an absurdly expensive nursery designer she planned to hire first thing in the morning. They were completely, blissfully intoxicated by their own greed. I slowly pulled back the cuff of my silk blouse and glanced down at my wristwatch. The sleek silver hands moved with quiet, relentless precision. It was currently 6:58 in the evening. Today was Thursday, the 25th of November, Thanksgiving Day. But in the corporate banking world, the 25th of every single month carried a very different and far more significant meaning. It was the designated date for automated institutional debt collection. When you structure a commercial business loan of a certain size, the bank does not sit around waiting for you to mail them a paper check. They do not send gentle, polite reminder emails. They require direct, unfettered access to the primary operating account of the designated limited liability company. And precisely at 7 o'clock in the evening, Eastern Standard Time, the automated clearinghouse system initiates an irreversible sweep of the required funds. I watched the second hand on my watch glide past the 12. 6:59. Trey laughed loudly at some joke my father had made, leaning back and resting both hands behind his head, looking for all the world like a man who had just conquered the entire globe. He had absolutely no idea that the digital infrastructure of his newly acquired banking portal was, at that very moment, quietly waking up, verifying his brand new administrative credentials, and preparing to execute its monthly protocol without mercy. I picked up my water glass, my hand perfectly steady. The ambient jazz music swelled gently in the background. My mother laughed. Amber touched her stomach affectionately. Trey took another long, satisfied drink of my expensive wine. 10 seconds left. 5 seconds. I stared directly at Trey's expensive smartphone, resting face up on the polished wood beside his plate, and waited patiently for the digital guillotine to fall. Exactly at 7 o'clock, it fell. Trey's phone vibrated violently against the mahogany, its screen lighting up with a bright, urgent notification banner. The sudden buzzing sound cut sharply through the smooth jazz music and the loud, boastful laughter still filling my dining room. Because I had just transferred all of the master administrative privileges over to him, his personal email was now directly linked to the primary banking portal of the limited liability company. Every single financial alert, every transaction receipt, every automated banking trigger was now routed straight to the device sitting inches from his dinner plate. Trey paused in the middle of his grand story about leveraging real estate. He glanced down at the glowing screen, clearly annoyed by the sudden interruption. He probably expected it to be nothing more than a welcome email from the state tax board, or some generic confirmation message from a corporate domain registry. He picked up the phone with a lazy, arrogant flick of his wrist, his other hand still cradling his crystal wine glass. He tapped the notification banner open, bringing the screen closer to his face. I watched him with absolute, unwavering focus. It is a rare and genuinely fascinating thing to witness the exact second an entire fabricated reality collapses in on itself. First, his eyebrows furrowed in deep confusion. Then, the arrogant, self-satisfied smirk that had been plastered across his face all evening vanished completely. His jaw went slack. The hand holding his expensive wine began to tremble, just slightly, sending a faint ripple across the dark red surface inside the glass. He blinked hard, aggressively, swiping down to refresh the email app, clearly hoping against hope that the numbers staring back at him were nothing more than some bizarre digital glitch. He tapped into the attached secure portal link, his thumb now moving frantically across the screen. The confident, booming finance expert of 2 minutes earlier was gone, replaced by a man staring straight into the abyss of total financial ruin. Amber noticed his sudden silence. She stopped mid-sentence with my mother, abandoning her monologue about the ridiculously expensive nursery designer, and frowned at him. "Trey, honey, what is it?" she asked, her voice tinged with irritation. "Put the phone away. We're celebrating our new business. You can look at emails tomorrow." Trey didn't answer her. He didn't even look at her. His eyes stayed glued to the bright screen of his phone. He set his wine glass down on the table so hard that the crystal chimed loudly, nearly spilling the dark red liquid onto the white linen tablecloth. "What the hell is this?" Trey muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. My father froze. The piece of turkey he'd been about to eat stopped halfway to his mouth. Richard knew exactly what that notification was. The color drained entirely from his face, leaving him looking pale, drawn, and suddenly very, very old. "Speak up, Trey," my father demanded, trying and failing to inject a false sense of authority into his suddenly shaking voice. "What are you looking at? If it's just a vendor invoice, ignore it until Monday." Trey finally looked up from his phone, his eyes darting frantically between my father and me. His chest heaved as he struggled to process the information now displaying across his banking dashboard. He leaned forward, bracing both hands against the edge of the dining table. Why is there an auto draft of $150,000 pending from the operating account? Trey asked, his voice cracking with rising panic. The dining room went completely, utterly silent. Even my mother stopped chewing, her fork suspended midair, as the sheer size of the number registered fully in her mind. $150,000 was not some minor administrative fee. It was not a shipping penalty. It was a massive sum of money, and it was, at that exact moment, being automatically extracted from an account Trey now legally, fully owned. Trey looked directly at me, his eyes wide, pleading for some kind of explanation. Sienna, what is this? Did you schedule some massive vendor payout right before you handed over the credentials? Did you try to steal from the company accounts on your way out? Cancel it. Cancel the transaction right now. I calmly reached for my linen napkin, folded it neatly, and set it beside my plate. I looked at Trey, then let my gaze shift toward my father, who was suddenly sweating quite profusely beneath the warm glow of the crystal chandelier. I didn't schedule anything, Trey, I replied, my voice perfectly steady and clear. I have absolutely no control over that account anymore. You changed the passwords yourself, remember. That transaction is an automated institutional sweep. It happens on the 25th of every single month, precisely at 7 in the evening. Trey shook his head, his breathing growing shallow and rapid. What do you mean? An institutional sweep? What institution? For what? I looked at him, feeling no pity whatsoever. I think you should read the description attached to the pending transaction, I suggested simply. Trey practically shoved his face back into his phone. He read the tiny text beneath the massive deduction amount, his voice trembling as he spoke the words aloud to the silent room. SBA loan repayment, principal and interest. The words hung in the air like a heavy, suffocating blanket. Trey stared at his screen, his mind clearly straining to reject the information his own eyes were transmitting. The notification banner glowed on, an unyielding digital witness to the catastrophic mistake he had just made. I reached for my crystal glass of vodka on the rocks. The ice clinked softly against the sides as I lifted it. I took a slow, deliberate sip. The cold liquid burned pleasantly down my throat, grounding me firmly in the absolute reality of the moment. I lowered the glass, my eyes shifting from Trey's horrified expression to my father, frozen at the head of the table. Richard was gripping the edges of the mahogany table so tightly his knuckles had turned completely white. He looked like a man standing on the gallows, watching the executioner slowly lower the hood over his head. The proud, booming patriarch who had just toasted to his own brilliance moments earlier was entirely, unmistakably, gone. I looked right at him, feeling a deep, satisfying sense of closure wash quietly over me. Should I tell them now? I asked, my voice carrying clearly across the silent dining room. Or do you want to do the honors, Dad? My father opened his mouth, but absolutely no sound came out. He swallowed hard, his throat working frantically, but his usual booming authority had completely evaporated. He tried weakly to raise a hand to silence me, a pathetic little gesture that only made him look profoundly guilty. He could not look at Amber. He could not look at Trey. Trey slammed his hand flat against the table, making the fine china jump. What loan? He demanded, his voice cracking under the sheer pressure. Sienna, look at me right now. What the hell is this loan? I turned my attention fully back to my newly minted chief executive officer, folding my hands neatly in my lap. It's exactly what it says it is, Trey, I explained calmly, keeping the professional tone of a corporate advisor delivering unwelcome news. Sienna Botanicals LLC is currently carrying a massive commercial debt, specifically, a $6 million business loan secured through the Small Business Administration. Amber gasped loudly, pressing both hands against her chest as though she had physically been shot. $6 million, she repeated, the number clearly far too massive for her entitled mind to properly absorb. She looked at Trey, waiting for him to laugh it off, waiting for him to reassure her it was all just some misunderstanding. But Trey was not laughing. He shook his head violently, his eyes wild with aggressive denial. "No," he stammered, pointing a shaking finger toward the tablet I had slid across the table earlier. "That's completely impossible. I didn't see any debt schedules listed on the ownership transfer documents. I did not sign any commercial loan agreements tonight." "You didn't have to sign any new loan agreements," I pointed out, leaning forward slightly to make sure he absorbed every single word. "You signed a blanket assumption of liability the moment you formally took over the LLC. You didn't ask to see the balance sheets. You didn't ask for a list of active creditors or request a review of the corporate credit profile. You simply saw the word ownership and rushed blindly to sign your name before I could possibly change my mind. When you accept an LLC, Trey, you accept its assets and its debts. All of them, together, as a package." Trey looked as though he might genuinely be sick. As a man who claimed deep expertise in high-level finance, he knew exactly what an assumption of liability meant. He understood, with sickening clarity, the inescapable legal trap he had just sprinted headlong into, wearing a giant, arrogant smile the entire way. "And that notification you just received," I continued, my voice steady and unyielding, "is the automated draft for the monthly principal and interest payment, $150,000, withdrawn automatically every single month, on the 25th, right around dinner time. That is the burn rate you just inherited tonight." Diane finally found her voice, though it emerged as barely more than a high-pitched squeak. "But Sienna, the company revenue covers that, right? You're a successful brand. You just pay the loan out of the profits from the makeup sales." I smiled at my mother, a cold, sharp little smile. Trey did not share my mother's naive optimism. He stared at his phone, his breathing jagged and uneven, and ran a hand across his face, wiping away the cold sweat that had suddenly broken out across his forehead. He understood the brutal math instantly. $150,000 a month was an aggressive, suffocating repayment schedule, precisely the kind of financial drain that could sink an otherwise healthy company almost instantly if cash flow was disrupted for even a handful of days. "You set me up," Trey whispered, his voice shaking with a terrifying blend of rage and sheer panic. "You set me up to take the fall for this massive debt." "I didn't set you up to do anything," I replied smoothly. "I simply sat here and watched you demand the keys to a burning building. You wanted the company. You insulted my intelligence at my own table. You offered me a job in my own warehouse, and you laughed in my face while doing it. I just gave you exactly what you so aggressively demanded." Amber grabbed Trey's arm, her perfectly manicured nails digging sharply into his suit jacket. "Trey," she pleaded, her voice rising into full hysteria. "What does this mean? We cannot afford to pay a bank $150,000 a month. Cancel the transfer. Give the company back to her right now." Trey looked at his wife with a hollow, devastated expression. He understood the legal reality of what they had just done far better than she did. The digital ink was already dry. The administrative authorizations had already been processed by both the state and the bank. "We can't just give it back, Amber," Trey said, his voice utterly defeated. "The liability is already legally in our names." Trey was, unfortunately for him, absolutely right. The liability was now irrevocably tied to their names. I watched my sister physically recoil from her husband, her hands dropping away from his arm as though he had suddenly contracted something contagious. She looked over at our father, her eyes wide with desperate confusion. "Dad?" Amber pleaded, her voice cracking apart. "Tell me this is a joke. Tell me you didn't just trick us into taking on a $6 million debt." Richard opened his mouth, but he looked like a fish suffocating on dry land, gasping uselessly. He could not form a single coherent sentence. He just kept wiping the heavy sweat from his forehead with his expensive linen napkin, his eyes darting frantically toward the front door, as though he were quietly calculating whether he could simply bolt from the dining table altogether. "Since my father seems to have temporarily misplaced his booming executive voice," I said, "I'll go ahead and fill in the blanks for everyone myself." I reached back into my leather tote bag and pulled out a thick black folder I had prepared earlier that week. I dropped it onto the center of the mahogany table, where it landed with a heavy, satisfying thud. I flipped it open, revealing a stack of high-quality printouts bearing the unmistakable letterhead of a major commercial lender. "What you're looking at," I explained, tapping the top page, "is the master loan origination file. Exactly 3 years ago, my father realized that his name was still legally listed as the primary owner of Sienna Botanicals LLC. He also realized that the company was generating massive gross revenue. So he went to a commercial bank, presented himself as sole proprietor, and applied for a massive commercial expansion loan backed by the Small Business Administration." Trey leaned over the table, his eyes scanning the documents upside down. "He got approved for $6 million, Trey whispered, absolutely horrified. "How did you not know he pulled $6 million out of your own operating account?" "Because he didn't put it into the operating account, Trey," I corrected him sharply. "He set up a shadow account under the LLC's umbrella, a completely separate ledger I had zero visibility into. The bank evaluated the company based on its tax returns, approved the funds, and wired the full $6 million directly into his private secret account." My mother clutched her chest, her face gone completely pale. "Richard?" Diane gasped, her voice trembling with genuine horror. "What did you do with $6 million? We don't have anything close to that kind of money sitting in our savings." I flipped to the second page of the binder, which contained detailed bank statements and wire transfer logs, and decided it was worth reading a few of them aloud for the benefit of the entire room. "Let's review the corporate expenditures of the former chief executive," I announced clearly. Within the very first month of securing the loan, he wired $400,000 to an offshore account in the Cayman Islands. A week later, another $200,000 went straight to a casino in Atlantic City. Over the following 2 years, he systematically drained millions of dollars to cover massive, high-stakes gambling debts. He used my company as his own personal piggy bank, funding a secret gambling addiction one wire transfer at a time. Richard finally found his voice. "It was an investment," he croaked, his hands shaking violently. "I had a system. I was going to double the money and quietly put it all back before anyone ever noticed." "You bet $6 million on blackjack and horses," I fired back, my voice dripping with absolute disgust. "You are not an investor, Dad. You are a degenerate gambler who stole from his own daughter." Trey grabbed the folder, flipping through the pages frantically, then stopped abruptly at a specific transaction line, his eyes widening. "Wait a minute," Trey said, his voice dropping into a dangerous growl, pointing a shaking finger at a massive wire transfer. "What is this withdrawal here, for $800,000? This didn't go to a casino. This went into a real estate escrow account." I smiled, turning my attention toward my sister, who is currently doing her level best to make herself as small as possible in her chair. "I'm so glad you found that particular line item, Trey," I said brightly. "That $800,000 went toward purchasing a luxury vacation home in Aspen, a beautiful ski-in, ski-out property. But the deed isn't in my father's name." I paused for just a moment, letting the tension build to its peak. "Dad bought that house under a private trust," I revealed, locking eyes with Amber. "And the sole beneficiary of that trust happens to be you, Amber. He used the commercial loan secured against my company to buy his golden child a secret mountain retreat, all while I had absolutely no idea any of it existed. Trey slowly turned his head to stare at his pregnant wife. The veins in his neck were bulging visibly now. He looked completely unhinged. "You knew," Trey hissed, his voice lethal and cold. "You knew about the Aspen house." "I swear I didn't know where the money came from," Amber cried hysterically, tears streaming down her face and ruining her expensive makeup in dark, streaky lines. "Dad just told me it was an early inheritance. He said it was an investment property for the baby. I had absolutely no idea it was tied to Sienna's company." "It's not tied to my company anymore, Amber," I reminded her cheerfully. "It's tied to your company now. You and Trey currently owe the bank $6 million for a loan that funded your own vacation home and quietly bankrolled your father's gambling addiction. And as of tonight, the grace period is officially, permanently over." The words hung heavily in the dead, motionless air of the dining room. I let the full weight of that final sentence sink slowly, thoroughly into their minds. "What do you mean the grace period is over?" Trey asked, his voice barely a whisper, thin and cracked, as though the words themselves frightened him. I closed the black folder in front of me and folded my hands neatly on top of it, letting the silence stretch just long enough to make everyone at the table uncomfortable. I looked directly at my father, who was suddenly and very deliberately refusing to make eye contact with anyone at the table. He was staring down at his half-eaten plate of turkey, as if it held the secrets of the entire universe, as if the gravy congealing on the china could somehow save him from what was coming. "Did you honestly think he woke up this morning overflowing with holiday generosity?" I asked Trey, gesturing lazily toward my father. "Did you really believe that a man who has controlled every single financial aspect of this family for decades suddenly decided to hand over a multi-million-dollar enterprise out of the goodness of his heart? Let me explain the exact timing of this beautiful Thanksgiving miracle." I turned my attention to my mother, who was sitting completely frozen at the far end of the table, gripping her crystal wine glass so tightly her knuckles had gone stark white. "For the past 12 months, I said, my father has been fighting a losing battle with the commercial lender." I explained it slowly, keeping my tone perfectly conversational, almost pleasant, as though I were discussing the weather instead of detonating a bomb over Thanksgiving dinner. "He missed 3 consecutive monthly payments earlier this year. The bank threatened to accelerate the loan and demand the entire $6 million balance immediately, in full, no exceptions. Desperate to avoid absolute ruin, he begged for a temporary forbearance agreement. A short window of leniency meant to give him time to restructure his finances and get the payments back on track." My father squeezed his eyes shut. He knew exactly what I was about to say next, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. "The bank granted him that forbearance," I continued, my voice echoing faintly off the high ceiling of the dining room. "But that forbearance agreement has a strict expiration date. It ends next Tuesday. On December 1st, the bank is legally authorized to begin aggressive collection protocols. They were preparing to seize his primary residence, freeze his personal brokerage accounts, and liquidate everything he owns to satisfy the massive debt he accumulated through his gambling addiction." I paused deliberately, letting my gaze drift slowly to Amber. She was staring at me now with wide, horrified eyes, her fork frozen halfway to her mouth. "So he needed a way out," I said smoothly, almost gently. "He needed someone else to hold the bag. He could not sell the limited liability company to a legitimate buyer because any standard corporate audit would instantly reveal the $6 million debt and the missing cash. No real investor would ever touch it once they saw the books. He needed a buyer who was incredibly greedy, painfully arrogant, and entirely too eager to sign the transfer papers without doing a single shred of basic financial due diligence." I looked right at Trey and let the words land like stones. "He needed you, Trey. He transferred the limited liability company into your name today. Today, right before the long holiday weekend, because it was his absolute last chance to legally dump the financial liability onto someone else before the bank came for his own house. You are not the new chief executive officer. You are the sacrificial lamb. A sharp, shattering sound exploded through the dining room. My mother had dropped her crystal wine glass. It smashed into dozens of glittering pieces against the hardwood floor, sending a dark red puddle of expensive Bordeaux splashing violently across the pristine white rug beneath the table. She did not even seem to notice the mess spreading around her ankles. She just stared at my father with a look of pure, unadulterated horror etched across her face. "Richard," Diane whispered, her voice shaking violently, barely able to form the words. "Tell me she is lying. Tell me you did not just trick our pregnant daughter into taking on your massive gambling debts to save yourself." Amber suddenly let out a sharp, choking gasp. Her hands flew to her chest, her breathing turning into rapid, shallow pants. She pushed herself away from the table with both hands, her chair scraping loudly and violently against the floor. "I cannot breathe," she choked out, tears streaming down her face in thick, unbroken lines, smearing her carefully applied makeup. "Trey, I cannot breathe. We cannot owe $6 million. We just bought the new house. The baby is coming. We are going to lose everything." She began to hyperventilate in earnest, her chest heaving uncontrollably as the sheer magnitude of the betrayal crashed down on her all at once. The golden child, the daughter who had been protected and coddled her entire life, wrapped in every comfort our parents could buy, had just been served up on a silver platter by the very father she had always idolized without question. Richard jumped up from his chair so fast it nearly toppled backward, his face flushed a deep, furious purple. He slammed both hands down flat on the table, rattling the plates, trying desperately to reclaim his booming, familiar authority. "Everyone needs to calm down right now," Richard shouted, his voice cracking slightly under the strain, betraying him even as he tried to project control. "Sienna is intentionally twisting the facts to scare you. Yes, there is a loan. Yes, I made some bad investments. But the business is highly profitable. You all know how much product she sells. The holiday orders alone bring in millions." He pointed a shaking finger across the table at Trey. "You are a finance man, Trey. You know how to manage cash flow. The revenue from the makeup sales will easily cover the monthly payments. You just use the company income to pay Furious because she is out of a job, and she wants to ruin our night. Do not let her manipulate you. The company makes more than enough money to handle this." Trey looked at my father, his eyes practically bulging out of his head, his jaw working silently. He looked, for one brief moment, like he wanted to leap across the table and strangle the older man with his bare hands. But before Trey could unleash his fury, I reached into my leather bag one final time. My father was right about one thing. The company revenue was massive. But he was about to learn a very painful, very expensive lesson about corporate structure. Trey suddenly stopped pacing. The sheer panic that had gripped him just moments earlier seemed to evaporate entirely, replaced by a sudden, manic surge of adrenaline. He was a man who had built his entire identity on the illusion of financial supremacy, and his ego absolutely refused to let him be cast as the victim of a bad deal, even now, even here. He wiped the sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand, his breathing slowing as his mind frantically grasped onto my father's desperate justification like a life raft in open water. "You know what?" Trey said, his voice rising, regaining that arrogant edge that had irritated me all evening. He pointed a finger at me across the ruined turkey. "Your father is right. You are just trying to scare us because you are out of the game. 6 million sounds like a lot to a small-minded girl who used to mix lotion in her kitchen. But in the real corporate world, $6 million of leveraged debt is absolutely nothing." Amber looked up at him, her mascara-streaked cheeks pale and trembling. "What are you talking about, Trey?" she cried. "It is $6 million. We do not have it. We do not need to have it in cash." "Amber," Trey snapped, clearly annoyed that his own wife could not keep up with his supposed genius. He turned to face the entire room, spreading his arms wide as if he were delivering a keynote speech at some glittering investor conference. "Do the math. Sienna just admitted her company generates massive revenue. Industry experts value the Sienna Botanicals brand at roughly $50 million based on its current market share and exclusive retailer contracts." He began pacing again, but this time with the confident swagger of a Wall Street shark closing a hostile takeover. "So we inherited a $6 million liability. Big deal. We also inherited a $50 million asset. You take the $50 million, subtract the $6 million debt, and that still leaves us with a net equity of $44 million. My mother let out a small, breathless gasp, her hands flying to her mouth as the massive number registered fully in her mind. "$44 million? Diane whispered, her eyes darting rapidly between my father and Trey. "Richard, is that true?" My father quickly nodded, grabbing onto Trey's logic like a drowning man clutching a life raft. "Exactly," my father agreed, his booming voice returning in full force. "The brand is a gold mine. The debt is just a minor operational cost. I told you Trey knew what he was doing." Trey let out a loud, mocking laugh, looking down at me with absolute triumph written across his face. "Did you really think you could outsmart me, Sienna?" he sneered. "Did you think a little commercial loan would send me running? You just gave me a multi-million-dollar payday. I am not even going to bother running your warehouse. I am not going to deal with logistics or holiday shipping penalties. I am just going to flip the entire enterprise. I will sell Sienna Botanicals to a private equity firm, pay off your father's little debt, and Amber and I will walk away with $44 million in pure profit by Christmas." He pulled his phone back out of his pocket, his thumbs moving rapidly across the screen. "You do not believe me. Watch this," Trey commanded the room, his voice thick with self-satisfaction. "I have a major contact at a top-tier private equity firm in Manhattan. They acquire high-growth cosmetic brands all the time. I am going to call him right now, put him on speakerphone, and we will start the acquisition process tonight." Nobody moved. My parents watched him with breathless anticipation, their hopes entirely pinned on this arrogant man's contacts and connections. Amber sniffled, sitting up a little straighter in her chair, the dollar signs clearly flashing back into her eyes despite the tears still drying on her cheeks. Trey tapped the screen and placed the phone flat in the center of the mahogany dining table. He hit the speaker button. The dial tone echoed loudly through the silent room, each ring stretching the tension a little further. 1 ring, 2 rings, 3 rings. Finally, a deep, professional voice answered the line. "This is David." "David, my man," Trey shouted enthusiastically, leaning over the table toward the phone. "It is Trey. Listen, I have an incredible opportunity for your firm, and I wanted to give you the first look before I take it to the open market. I just acquired full ownership and controlling interest of Sienna Botanicals LLC, the organic skincare line." There was a brief pause on the other end of the line. "Sienna Botanicals?" the broker asked, his tone suddenly shifting to sharp, professional interest. "The brand with the exclusive Sephora distribution contracts?" "That is the one," Trey boasted, shooting a triumphant glare in my direction. "I am looking to initiate a fast cash buyout. The brand is easily valued at $50 million. I am willing to fast-track an acquisition for your firm if we can start the paperwork on Monday." I sat back in my chair, picked up my vodka, and took another slow, deliberate sip. Trey had perfectly set the stage. He had built his fantasy castle high in the sky, completely unaware that he had built it on quicksand. The broker on the phone was about to give him a brutal education in corporate acquisitions, and I was going to enjoy every single second of it. The broker's voice echoed through the speakerphone, sharp and incredibly amused. "Mr. Sterling, I just ran the corporate registry search you requested. I am not sure who gave you this tip, but you are looking at a ghost." Trey leaned closer to the phone, his smug smile faltering instantly, cracking at the edges. "Check again. Sienna Botanicals LLC. She just signed a massive distribution deal. I have the press release right here in my hand." A harsh chuckle crackled over the line. "I do not need to check again. Sienna Botanicals LLC is an active entity, yes, but it is purely an operating shell. It holds zero assets, zero intellectual property, zero real estate. Its current valuation is essentially the cost of the state filing fee. You are trying to leverage a hollow cardboard box, buddy. Call me back when you have something real to sell." I reached across the turkey platter and tapped the red button on Trey's phone, ending the call abruptly, the silence afterward almost louder than the conversation had been. The silence in the dining room was absolute, heavy with the scent of roasted sage and sudden, crushing defeat. Trey stared at the blank screen of his phone, his mouth opening and closing uselessly, like a fish that had just been pulled from water and left gasping on dry land. I did not give him time to recover his fabricated confidence. I reached into my tote bag resting beside my chair, pulled out a massive leather-bound legal binder stamped with the red seal of the state of Delaware, and slammed it down squarely in the center of the Thanksgiving table. The crystal wine glasses rattled violently against each other. "You really thought I would make it that easy?" I asked, my voice deadly calm, almost soft. "You thought I would build a multi-million-dollar empire and leave it sitting in a single unprotected LLC where any greedy family member with a forged power of attorney could snatch it right out from under me." My mother, Eleanor, recovered her voice first, her face flushing a deep, angry crimson. "Sienna, what is the meaning of this? Why is your brother being humiliated by some broker on Thanksgiving?" "Trey humiliated himself," I replied evenly, gesturing to the heavy binder in front of me. "He tried to sell my company out from under me to cover his own massive debts. He just found out he stole the wrong paperwork from my home office." Trey slammed his fist on the table, knocking over his water glass, sending a thin sheet of water spreading across the linen. "Where is it? Where is the real company, Sienna? You owe this family." "I owe you nothing," I shot back, leaning forward so he could see the absolute conviction burning in my eyes. "I learned my lesson 10 years ago, when you drained my college savings account to buy that ridiculous sports car, and Mom and Dad called it an early inheritance advance for their golden boy. I realized then that if I ever built anything of value, I had to bury it so deep that none of you could ever touch it." I flipped open the heavy binder, the crisp pages turning with a sharp, deliberate snap. "Sienna Botanicals LLC is just the public face. It leases the manufacturing equipment from SB Holdings. It licenses the formulas and patents from Aurora Innovations, and the physical real estate is owned by a blind trust registered in Wyoming. I am the sole beneficiary and managing director of all of them. You cannot touch a single cent of it." My father stood up abruptly, throwing his linen napkin onto his plate in disgust. "This is incredibly selfish, Sienna. Your brother is in serious trouble. His investment firm is threatening to seize his assets. We are talking about his home, his children's future. You have all this hidden wealth, and you are playing games with holding companies instead of helping your own blood." "He is not in trouble because of bad luck, Dad," I countered, refusing to back down an inch from his glare. "He is in trouble because he embezzled client funds to support a lifestyle he could not afford. You want me to liquidate my life's work to pay off his criminal mistakes?" "It was a temporary cash flow issue," Trey shouted, his perfectly styled hair now completely disheveled, sticking up in places where he had raked his fingers through it. I was going to put the money back. If you just sign over the IP rights to me, I can secure a bridge loan by Monday. You can afford to lose one division of your little skincare brand. My little skincare brand is currently valued at $45 million, I stated clearly and without hesitation, watching the blood drain completely from both my parents' faces in real time. And I am not signing over a single jar of moisturizer to save you from federal prison. Eleanor grabbed my arm, her manicured nails digging sharply into my skin. You will do as you are told. We gave you everything. We raised you. If you do not transfer those patents to your brother right now, I will ensure you are dead to this family. We will ruin your reputation in this city. I gently but firmly pried her fingers off my arm, feeling a profound and unexpected sense of liberation wash over me as I did it. The threat of being cast out used to terrify me down to my bones. Now it was exactly what I wanted, exactly what I had been quietly hoping for. You cannot ruin my reputation, Mom, because I do not operate in your shallow country club circles, I said calmly. But speaking of ruining reputations and losing homes, there is one more detail in this binder you should probably see. I flipped to the very last tab in the Delaware file and pulled out a single notarized document, placing it deliberately right on top of the ruined turkey carcass. Trey was not just looking for a bridge loan, I announced, watching my brother's eyes widen in absolute, unfiltered terror. He already took one out 3 months ago, and you will never guess what he used as collateral. He used a forged assignment of ownership for Sienna Botanicals, LLC, I said, my voice cutting through the heavy air of the dining room like a scalpel through skin. He pledged my company to a private equity firm in Chicago, a firm notorious for hostile takeovers and aggressive asset seizures. The only problem for Trey is that he pledged a phantom. He handed them a piece of paper that legally entitles them to absolutely nothing. Trey slumped back into his mahogany dining chair, all the fight draining out of him at once. His face had gone the color of wet ash. He stared blindly at the notarized document resting on the carcass of the Thanksgiving turkey, unable to look away. My father leaned forward, his brow deeply furrowed in genuine mounting confusion. I do not understand any of this, Sienna. You just told us your brand is worth $45 million. You have products in major retail stores across the country. How can you say he pledged nothing? Because, Dad, I replied, folding my hands neatly on the table once more. Sienna Botanicals, LLC is merely a distributor. It is a vendor. It does not own a single drop of the products it sells. It is time for a quick lesson in corporate law, something I spent years studying while Trey was busy failing out of his expensive business fraternity. I stood up, feeling the immense weight of the past decade finally lifting off my shoulders all at once, like a physical thing sliding away. I began to pace slowly behind my chair, commanding the room effortlessly, every eye following me. When I was 18 years old, you two decided to empty my college savings account. You handed my future over to Trey so he could buy a sports car he crashed 3 months later. You told me it was a necessary family sacrifice. You told me I was smart enough to figure it out on my own. And you were right. I did figure it out. But the lesson I learned was not about hard work or family loyalty. The lesson was that my own blood would financially ruin me if it benefited their golden boy. My mother opened her mouth to protest, but the sheer venom in my gaze silenced her instantly, the words dying before she could speak them. So at 18, while working 3 jobs to pay for community college, I spent every free hour in the campus law library. I continued. I learned about asset protection. I learned about corporate veils. And before I ever mixed my first batch of serum in my tiny kitchen, I filed the paperwork to form a Delaware C Corp. I named it Sienna Holdings. Trey buried his face in his hands. A low, pathetic groan escaped his throat, muffled against his palms. He worked in finance. He knew exactly what a Delaware C Corp meant, and the implication was already dawning on him with sickening clarity. My parents, however, were still struggling to catch up to the full reality of the situation. A Delaware C Corp, I explained, looking directly at my father, offers the strongest corporate shield in the world. It provides absolute privacy and impenetrable asset protection. Nobody knows who owns it unless I want them to. And more importantly, nobody can pierce that veil to take what is mine. Sienna Holdings is the true powerhouse. It is the absolute fortress that houses my entire empire. I walked back to the table and tapped the heavy binder for emphasis, letting the sound punctuate my words. I meticulously assigned every single piece of intellectual property I ever generated directly into that corporate entity. Every single organic cosmetic formula I ever created, from the vitamin C serums to the overnight masks, belongs entirely to the C Corp. The proprietary extraction method for our blue tansy oil. The exact chemical stabilizers that make our products last longer than any competitor on the market. All of it belongs to the Corp. The trademarks for the brand name, the logo, the specific designs of our packaging. It all resides safely locked inside Sienna Holdings. I paused, letting the reality of my structural masterpiece sink deep into their minds, watching it land one piece at a time. And that massive exclusive distribution contract with Sephora that made headline news last month? I asked, a bitter smile touching my lips. The one that guarantees prime shelf space in over 800 stores nationwide. The one Trey thought he was selling to the highest bidder today. That contract is exclusively negotiated and held by Sienna Holdings. Sienna Botanicals LLC simply executes the shipping logistics. If Trey's private equity friends try to seize the LLC, all they will get is a stack of empty cardboard boxes and a leased warehouse space in New Jersey. They get zero intellectual property. They get zero revenue streams. My father's face went completely pale, drained of every trace of color. He looked from me to Trey, finally understanding the sheer magnitude of the disaster unfolding in front of him. Trey, my father whispered, his voice trembling. If you pledged assets you did not actually own to a private equity firm to secure a multi-million-dollar loan, that is not just a bad business deal. That is wire fraud. That is a federal crime. I nodded slowly, locking eyes with my brother across the wreckage of the dinner table. Exactly. Trey forged my signature to claim he had controlling interest in the LLC. Then he presented the LLC to the lenders as the sole owner of my patents and Sephora contracts. He committed felony fraud to secure millions, which he immediately dumped into his failing investment fund to hide his embezzlement. Eleanor gasped, her hands flying to her mouth in pure, undisguised horror. Sienna, you have to fix this. You have to transfer the patents to the LLC right now. If you do not, your brother will go to federal prison. They will arrest him. I looked down at my mother, feeling absolutely nothing but cold, hard clarity settle over me like a second skin. I will not move a single asset, I said firmly, without a trace of hesitation. I spent 10 years building an empire from the dirt up, specifically designing it so that none of you could ever steal it. I built an impenetrable fortress, Mom, and I am not lowering the drawbridge just because the wolf you raised is finally at your door. The silence that followed my declaration was absolute and suffocating, pressing down on the room like a physical weight. The only sound in the dining room was the soft, steady ticking of the antique grandfather clock in the hallway, counting down the seconds to my brother's inevitable ruin with maddening indifference. Trey looked like a man who had just stepped off a cliff and was suspended in midair, waiting helplessly for gravity to finally pull him down. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing frantically in his throat. But the LLC still has value, he stammered, desperation bleeding into every syllable. It has the warehouses. It has the employee contracts. It has the physical inventory. The private equity firm will take that and liquidate it. It might not cover the whole loan, but it will be something. They can still operate the distribution side. I let out a harsh, humorless laugh that echoed off the crystal chandelier hanging above us. You really have no idea how a modern supply chain works, do you? I asked, walking slowly back toward my seat. I did not sit down. I simply rested my hands on the high back of the chair, looking down at the man who had tormented me for years, savoring the moment. Let me clarify exactly what Sienna Botanicals LLC is, I said, making sure every word landed razor-sharp and perfectly enunciated. It is not an independent entity with its own operational autonomy. It is a glorified third-party vendor, a middleman, nothing more. My Delaware C Corp, Sienna Holdings, hired that LLC exclusively to manage the physical bottling, labeling, and shipping of the products. That is it. I watched my father's eyes widen as he finally grasped the full mechanical reality of my business structure, piece by piece, like watching a building collapse in slow motion. The LLC does not own the warehouses, Trey, I continued, my voice steady and unrelenting. It leases them from a commercial real estate firm on a month-to-month basis. The employees are hired through a temporary staffing agency. The LLC does not even own the forklifts or the conveyor belts. Those are rented too. And as for the physical inventory, the serums, the creams, the raw materials. I leaned forward, locking my gaze with his terrified eyes. The LLC does not own those either. The inventory remains the exclusive property of Sienna Holdings until the exact moment it is scanned at a retail register or delivered to a customer's doorstep. The LLC simply holds it in trust, temporarily, on my terms. If your private equity friends try to seize the warehouse contents tomorrow, they will be stealing property directly from my C Corp, and my corporate attorneys will file a massive theft and conversion lawsuit against them before lunchtime. Trey's hands began to shake violently, uncontrollably. He knocked over his wine glass, sending a pool of dark red Cabernet seeping into the pristine white linen tablecloth like a slow, spreading wound. He did not even try to clean it up. He just stared at it. But the vendor contract, he whispered, his voice cracking down the middle. The LLC has the exclusive vendor contract to distribute the products. That contract has to be worth millions. They can sell the rights to that contract to another logistics company. That was the moment I had been waiting for all night, the final fatal blow to his arrogant, parasitic existence. I reached into the front pocket of my tote bag and drew out a single crisp sheet of heavy bond paper, folded neatly into thirds. I rose, walked slowly around the table, and stopped right beside Trey's chair. Without a word, I let the paper drop onto his empty dinner plate. "Pick it up," I ordered. His fingers trembled as he fumbled the fold open. His eyes raced across the black type, and whatever color remained in his face drained away completely. "What is this?" my mother demanded, her voice climbing into something shrill and hysterical. "Sienna, what did you just hand him?" "Read it out loud, Trey," I said, ignoring her entirely. "Read it to the whole family." He opened his mouth. Nothing came out. He was physically unable to speak the words that had just sealed his fate. "Fine, I'll do it myself," I said, lifting the page back out of his limp hands. I cleared my throat and let my voice settle into something cold and clinical, almost procedural. "To whom it may concern, this letter serves as formal legal notice that Sienna Holdings Incorporated is exercising its right to invoke the termination clause outlined in Section 4, Paragraph B, of the Master Vendor Agreement with Sienna Botanicals LLC. I let the legal language hang in the air a moment, heavy and merciless. "As per the terms of our contract," I continued, Any unapproved change in ownership, controlling interest, or the pledging of the LLC as collateral to an outside entity constitutes a material breach of trust. Therefore, as of 5 o'clock this evening, my C Corp has formally terminated its vendor contract with your LLC, effective immediately, due to an unauthorized change of ownership. Out in the hallway, the grandfather clock began to chime the bottom of the hour. It sounded, in that frozen moment, like a death knell tolling over the whole table. "Your LLC is dead, Trey," I said, dropping the page back onto his plate. "It has no contracts left, no inventory, no assets of any kind. It is an empty shell wrapped around a massive loan. You handed a private equity firm a worthless piece of paper, and by Tuesday morning they are going to realize exactly what you did. That you defrauded them out of millions of dollars." My father slumped forward, burying his face in his hands. My mother had dissolved into uncontrollable sobbing, her flawless Thanksgiving spread now a ruined backdrop to her own unraveling. Trey simply sat there, staring down at the termination notice as his entire constructed world collapsed into dust in front of him. Amber, who had been sitting rigid beside Trey through all of it, finally snatched the notice out of his slack fingers. Her perfectly lined eyes scanned down the page at a furious pace, and her jaw dropped the moment she reached the bottom. She looked from the letter to Trey, then over to the thick Delaware binder resting beside the ruined turkey. $6 million, she whispered, her voice shaking with panic that was only just beginning to rise. "Trey, you told me we were securing a bridge loan against a $50 million asset. You told me we were buying out your sister's entire distribution network to save the firm. What does she mean the LLC is an empty shell?" Trey couldn't even look at her. He stared instead at the dark wine stains spreading slowly across the pristine white tablecloth. "Answer me!" Amber shrieked, slamming her palm flat against the table hard enough to make the remaining silverware jump. "Did you or did you not sign a personal guarantee for a $6 million loan from Vanguard Equity?" He finally nodded, a slow, agonized dip of his head that seemed to cost him something physical. Amber let out a sound that was half gasp, half sob. "A personal guarantee. That means they can take our house. They can take the cars, the vacation fund, the kids' college accounts. We don't own a cosmetics empire, Trey. We own a warehouse lease in New Jersey, and $6 million in immediate, unforgivable debt." The full gravity of her words settled over the dining room like a suffocating weight, pressing whatever oxygen was left right out of the air. The grand illusion of their wealth, built entirely on embezzlement, forgery, and fraud, had just evaporated in front of everyone. Then, abruptly, Trey's head snapped up. His eyes, glazed over moments earlier with pure shock, locked onto Richard, Amber's father, seated quietly at the far end of the table, his expression a mask of cold, detached calculation. In Trey's mind, Richard had always been the mastermind, the ruthless venture capitalist who had supposedly taken my brother under his wing. "This was your firm," Trey said, his voice dropping into something low, dangerous, and accusatory. "Vanguard Equity. Those are your old golfing buddies, Richard. You arranged the introduction. You pushed me toward them for the bridge loan." Richard wiped his mouth calmly with his linen napkin and set it down beside his plate. "I introduced you to a capital source, Trey. I did not instruct you to commit wire fraud to secure the funds. I assumed, as any experienced investor would, that you actually owned the assets you were pledging as collateral." "You knew!" Trey shouted, surging up so fast that his heavy dining chair crashed backward onto the floor behind him. "You went through the LLC paperwork with me personally. You told me it was a brilliant maneuver. You said Sienna was a naive girl who'd left her flank completely exposed, and that seizing control of the LLC would effectively hand me control of the entire brand. You orchestrated this whole scheme just to get your hands on a piece of her company. I gave you strategic advice based on the fabricated documents you brought me. Richard shot back, his patrician voice rising to match Trey's volume. You are the one who handed me a fake assignment of ownership. You assured me she had bundled all her intellectual property into that LLC. It is not my fault that you're too incompetent to understand the difference between a holding company and a vendor shell. You got outmaneuvered by a 28-year-old woman, and now you want to pin your monumental stupidity on me. Amber shot to her feet, physically stepping between her husband and her father. Dad, how could you let him sign a personal guarantee? You know Vanguard's reputation. They're sharks. They're liquidators. They destroy families for sport. I protected my own interests, Richard said coldly, adjusting his cuffs without so much as glancing at her. Vanguard required collateral. Your husband was desperate to cover the massive hole in his investment fund before the SEC caught wind of his embezzlement. He made his own bed. Now he has to lie in it. Trey lunged forward and grabbed Richard by the collar of his expensive cashmere sweater. I will drag you down with me. If I go to federal prison for fraud, I am telling every investigator that you masterminded the entire takeover. You advised me on every single step of the forgery. Get your hands off me, you pathetic failure, Richard roared, shoving Trey backward with a force that surprised everyone at the table. Trey stumbled, arms flailing, and crashed hard into the antique serving buffet behind him. A heavy silver tray and a stack of bone china plates clattered to the hardwood floor and shattered into hundreds of jagged pieces. My mother screamed and clutched at my father's arm. Stop it, both of you, right now. This is our family's Thanksgiving. There is no family left here, Eleanor, Richard sneered, smoothing his ruined collar back into place. Your son is a criminal, facing a federal indictment, and in the process he has just bankrupted my daughter. Amber, go upstairs and get the children right now. We are leaving. You will file for an emergency divorce and full asset separation first thing Monday morning. Trey turned to his wife, pure desperation written across his face. Amber, please, we can fix this. I can hire lawyers. We can fight them. With what money? Amber spat, angry tears carving tracks through her ruined makeup. You lost everything. You pledged our entire life on a lie. I am not letting my children grow up on the street because you wanted to play corporate raider with your sister's company. She spun on her heel and stormed out of the dining room, calling sharply for the children as she went. Richard followed close behind, not sparing a single backward glance at the wreckage of the family he had just helped destroy. I stood quietly at my place at the table, watching the so-called Golden family tear each other apart. They were vicious, greedy, and entirely self-serving underneath the polish. The instant the money vanished, so did every trace of their loyalty. My mother wept hysterically into her hands. My father stared blankly at the shattered china scattered across the floor, frozen by the sheer scale of the disaster unfolding around him. Trey stood alone amid the wreckage of his own life, breathing hard, his eyes darting around the room as though searching for an exit that simply did not exist. The heavy silence was broken abruptly by the scrape of a wooden chair. My mother, Diane, who only moments earlier had been weeping hysterically, suddenly rose to her feet. The fragile, overwhelmed facade she'd been wearing vanished instantly, replaced by a frantic, clawing desperation. She stumbled straight across the shattered china littering the hardwood floor, ignoring the sharp porcelain entirely, and lunged toward me. Before I could react, her hands clamped around my forearm, her grip startlingly strong, her sharp manicured nails digging deep into the fabric of my silk blouse. Sienna, you have to stop this right now, Diane pleaded, her voice cracking with a high, terrified edge. You've proven your point. You're smart. You're successful. We all see it now. But you have to reinstate that vendor contract. You have to call your lawyers and fix the holding company paperwork before Monday morning. I stared down at her hands gripping my arm and felt a visceral wave of disgust rise through me. I didn't move. I didn't pull away. I just looked at her, coldly. Fix his felony fraud, Mom? I asked, keeping my voice dangerously low and perfectly even. It was a mistake, she cried, shaking my arm slightly as tears streaked down her perfectly powdered face. A desperate mistake. Sienna, Amber is pregnant. She only found out last week. They're having their third child. If Vanguard calls in that loan, Trey goes to federal prison. Amber will be a single mother with absolutely nothing. The scandal will destroy our family's name in this entire city. You cannot let your own brother be locked in a cage. You cannot ruin your future nephew's life over a simple business dispute. And there it was, the ultimate trump card, the classic psychological maneuver she had spent 3 decades perfecting. She was weaponizing guilt, family obligation, and the sudden, remarkably convenient revelation of a pregnancy, all to force my immediate compliance. She wanted me to fold, exactly the way I always had as a child. Slowly, deliberately, I reached up and peeled her fingers off my arm, one at a time. I took a step backward, putting real physical distance between us, making certain I was entirely out of her reach, a boundary that was both physical and emotional, and completely non-negotiable. A simple business dispute, I repeated, letting the sheer absurdity of her words echo through the ruined dining room. Mom. He forged my signature on federal documents. He stole my corporate identity. He tried to sell my life's work to a private equity firm to cover up the fact that he embezzled money from his own clients. That is not a dispute. That is a string of serious federal crimes, and you are standing there, ankle deep in shattered dinner plates, demanding that I become an accomplice to wire fraud just to protect your golden boy. I am asking you to have a heart, Diane shrieked, her face twisting into a mask of pure desperation. We are your parents. We gave you life. We are blood. And then you spent the next 28 years making absolutely sure I knew I was second best. I shot back, my voice cutting through the air like a whip. Let's talk about having a heart, Diane. Where was your heart when I was working graveyard shifts at a downtown diner just to pay for my community college textbooks, while you bought Trey a brand new Rolex for his graduation? Where was your heart when I came to you with my very first business plan, asking for a simple $10,000 loan, and you laughed in my face? You told me to go get a safe receptionist job because I didn't have the intellect for business. Diane flinched backward as though I had physically struck her. She opened her mouth to respond, but I refused to surrender the narrative for even one more second. You built this monster, Mom, I said, pointing directly at Trey, who was still staring blankly at the wall, paralyzed by shock. You and Dad shielded him from every single consequence of his actions since the day he was born. When he crashed cars, you bought him new ones. When he failed his university classes, Dad bribed the alumni board to smooth it over. When he blew through his entire trust fund, you drained my college savings to cover his gambling debts. You taught him that the rules simply do not apply to him. You taught him there would always be a financial safety net, one woven almost entirely out of my sacrifices. My father tried to interject, raising a trembling hand from his seat. Sienna, please, be reasonable. We were only trying to be supportive parents. You were terrible parents, I said flatly, my gaze sweeping cold and even between the two of them. You created a dependent, entitled parasite who genuinely believes he can forge legal documents and steal millions of dollars without a single consequence, and now the real world has finally caught up with him. Vanguard Equity is not going to accept a tearful apology from his mother. Federal prosecutors do not care about Amber's new pregnancy. Diane collapsed back into her dining chair, burying her face in her arms. She began sobbing with a deep, wretched sound that shook her entire frame. You are a monster, she wailed into the ruined tablecloth. You are cold. You are utterly ruthless. I am exactly what the two of you forced me to become, I replied, my voice perfectly steady, devoid of empathy. I had to become ruthless just to survive in this house. I had to build an impenetrable corporate fortress because the very people who were supposed to protect me were the ones actively trying to tear me apart. I picked up the heavy Delaware corporate binder from the table and slid it carefully back into my leather tote bag, zipping it shut with a sharp, final snap. I am not your financial shield anymore, I told the three of them, looking at each in turn one last time. I will not sign over a single patent. I will not reinstate that vendor contract. I will not pay one dime of his criminal defense fees. When the FBI knocks on your door next week, don't bother calling me. Trey's head snapped toward me, his bloodshot eyes wide with fresh, absolute terror. The FBI? What do you mean? My corporate attorneys have already compiled a full dossier of your forged documents, I said, lifting my coat off the back of my chair. We sent it to the authorities this morning to preemptively protect Sienna Holdings from your mess. Happy Thanksgiving, Trey. You finally got exactly what you earned. Before I could even slide my arms into the sleeves of my coat, Amber burst back into the dining room, her face streaked with ruined mascara, her two young children trailing behind her, visibly bewildered. She had clearly been eavesdropping from the grand foyer, and she'd caught the mention of federal authorities. Richard was nowhere in sight, having apparently made good on his threat and abandoned the sinking ship entirely. Amber marched right up to me, her chest heaving with manic energy. "You think you can just pack up your little bag and leave?" she screamed, her voice shrill enough to make the crystal chandelier tremble overhead. "We are losing our home because of your selfish games. Vanguard is going to foreclose on our house by the end of the month. If the bank throws us out onto the street, we are moving into your apartment. We will pack up the kids and stay in your little downtown rental until you fix this holding company mess and clear Trey's name. You owe us a roof over our heads." I stopped mid-motion, letting my cashmere coat slide back off my shoulders and onto the chair. I looked at Amber, then at my brother, and finally at my parents, who were watching the exchange with a strange mixture of horror and sudden, desperate hope. They genuinely believed Amber's demand was a viable solution. They still saw me as the subservient daughter who could be bullied into providing shelter and resources on command. A slow, entirely genuine smile spread across my face, the first real smile I'd allowed myself all evening. "My apartment?" I asked, amusement clear in my voice. "Amber, do you honestly believe I live in a rental apartment?" "Of course you do," my mother snapped, her tear-streaked face twisting into a scowl. "You told us you were leasing a small place in the city. You said you only rented this house for the long weekend so we could finally have a proper Thanksgiving together." I reached back into my leather tote bag. The Delaware binder was already tucked safely away, but one more document remained at the very bottom, a document I had brought specifically for this inevitable moment. I pulled out a thick, heavy stock folder embossed with the seal of the county clerk's office. "I lied, Mom," I said simply. "I lied because I knew that if I told you the truth, the two of you would immediately demand to move in, or expect me to host your extravagant country club parties, or try to use my property as collateral for one of Trey's endless financial black holes." I opened the folder and pulled out a certified property deed, holding it up so the gold seal caught the light. "I don't rent an apartment," I said, locking eyes with Amber, whose arrogant expression was rapidly dissolving into confusion. "And I did not rent this house for the weekend. I bought this entire estate 2 years ago. I paid $3 million for it, in cash. It is legally held by the Wyoming Blind Trust I mentioned earlier, which means my name does not appear on any public registry anywhere. That's why Trey couldn't find a single real estate asset to seize when he tried to sell me out." The silence that fell over the room this time was of an entirely different character. It was the silence of absolute crushing defeat. My parents looked around the massive, elegantly appointed dining room as if seeing it for the very first time. The custom wainscoting, the imported marble fireplace, the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the manicured grounds. The reality that I owned every inch of it, free and clear, while their golden boy faced federal prison and total bankruptcy, finally shattered whatever delusions they were still clinging to. "You cannot move into my apartment, Amber," I continued, my tone dropping into something cold and authoritative, "because I already live right here, and I do not allow criminals or parasites inside my home." Trey let out a pathetic, strangled gasp. "Sienna, you can't kick us out. We have nowhere to go. Richard took the car. We're stranded." "You can call a rideshare," I replied, pulling my phone from my pocket and tapping the screen awake. "Or you can walk. I genuinely do not care, but you are no longer welcome on my property." My father stood, his face flushed with indignation. "You are throwing your own family out onto the street on Thanksgiving. Have you lost your mind? We are your parents." "You lost the right to call yourselves my parents the moment you cheered for my destruction," I fired back, stepping toward the head of the table. "I am giving all of you exactly 10 minutes to gather your belongings and walk out my front door. If anyone is still standing inside this house, or anywhere on my driveway, at the end of those 10 minutes, I will call the local police precinct and have every one of you arrested for criminal trespassing." "Sienna, please," my mother wailed, reaching for me again. "10 minutes, Mom," I interrupted sharply, lifting my phone. "The clock starts right now." I turned my back on all of them and walked purposefully toward the grand foyer, leaving them scrambling behind me in the ruins of the dining room. I could hear the chaos breaking out immediately, Amber frantically pulling her crying children toward the coat closet and shrieking at Trey to help her. My father loudly berating my mother for pushing me too far. Diane still sobbing hysterically, completely paralyzed by the sudden brutal shift in power. They were finally beginning to experience the consequences of a lifetime of cruelty, and I was finally taking my space back. I reached the grand foyer, the heels of my shoes clicking sharply against the polished marble floor. Just as I reached toward the hall closet for my coat, the heavy oak front door swung violently open, slamming against the wall with a deafening crack. Richard stormed back inside, his face mottled a furious purple, the cold November wind whipping through the open doorway behind him. He marched straight toward me, completely ignoring Amber and the children cowering near the staircase. "Open the main gate right now, you petulant child," Richard bellowed, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling as he jabbed a trembling, rage-filled finger inches from my face. "I tried to drive off the property, and your security gates require a manual exit code. You are unlawfully detaining me. I will add false imprisonment to the lawsuit I am filing against you Monday morning." I didn't flinch. I held my ground, looking directly at the man who had orchestrated my brother's attempt to steal my life's work. "You are not suing anyone, Richard," I said calmly, my voice steady and unwavering. "You are going to go back to your country club and figure out how to salvage what's left of your own reputation once federal investigators start asking why your private equity friends accepted forged collateral documents." Richard took another step forward, using his size to try to intimidate me. "I will sue you for breach of contract, for tortious interference, for emotional distress," he snarled, spit flying from his lips. "I have a team of corporate litigators who will tie your little holding company up in court for the next decade. We will drain every cent you have in legal fees until you're begging us to settle. You think you won this little game? I will destroy you." The rest of the family had spilled out of the dining room and into the foyer, drawn by Richard's shouting. My father looked utterly terrified. Trey was still hyperventilating, leaning against the archway for support. Slowly, I raised my phone, making sure the screen was clearly visible to everyone in the room. The 10-minute timer I'd set earlier was still counting down. But that was not the only app I had open. "You are completely out of your depth, Richard," I said, my tone dropping into a dangerous whisper. You think this is a game I'm playing? I am securing my borders. I tapped the screen once, pulling up my active call log. When I handed Trey that termination notice 15 minutes ago, I did not just sit there waiting for your predictable temper tantrums, I explained, sweeping my gaze around the foyer at the stunned faces of my family. I quietly pressed the panic button installed under the dining room table. It's linked directly to my private estate security firm and the local police precinct. I informed them I had hostile trespassers on my property who were refusing to leave. Richard's jaw dropped. You called the police? He stammered, all the aggressive bluster instantly draining from his voice. On your own family? Before I could answer, the crunch of heavy tires on gravel pierced the tense silence. Red and blue lights began flashing through the frosted glass panels of the front door, casting erratic, frantic shadows across the marble foyer floor. Right on cue, a cold smile touched my lips. Two loud, authoritative knocks hammered against the open door frame, and two uniformed officers stepped into the entryway, hands resting cautiously on their duty belts, immediately followed by two towering men in tactical gear, bearing the emblem of my private security firm on their chests. Ms. Wilson? The lead officer asked, stepping forward and assessing the chaotic scene. We received a panic alarm and a report of aggressive trespassers refusing to vacate the premises. Are you safe? I am perfectly safe, officer, I replied, gesturing toward the group huddled in the center of my foyer. But these individuals have been asked to leave my property multiple times, and the gentleman in the cashmere sweater was just threatening me with physical and legal retaliation. The officer turned his stern gaze on Richard, who suddenly looked very small and remarkably old. Sir, the officer said, his voice leaving no room whatsoever for debate. You need to step away from the homeowner immediately. This is a family dispute, my father protested weakly, hands raised. It's Thanksgiving. We're just having a disagreement. This is private property, and the owner has asked you to leave, the second officer said, pulling out a small notepad. Gather your belongings. You are all being escorted off the premises right now. If any of you cause a scene or refuse to comply, you will spend your Thanksgiving night in a holding cell. The humiliation washing over my family was almost palpable. The Wilsons, the people who had always cared more about their social standing and country club appearances than anything else in the world, were about to be publicly evicted by armed police officers. Amber began sobbing uncontrollably, grabbing her children's coats with shaking hands. Diane could barely walk straight. My father had to physically support her as they fumbled in the closet for their expensive jackets. Trey moved like a sleepwalker, staring blankly ahead as a security guard steered him toward the door. Richard didn't say another word. He grabbed his coat, shot me one last look of pure, unadulterated venom, and marched out, escorted closely by an officer. I stood quietly in my beautiful, peaceful foyer, watching them all file out into the freezing November night, the flashing police lights illuminating their faces at the exact moment their arrogant little empire finally crumbled to dust. They had tried to steal everything I built, and instead, they had lost absolutely everything they had. The lead officer turned to me before pulling the door closed. We'll make sure they're completely off the estate. Have a good evening. Thank you, officer, I replied softly. I definitely will. The heavy oak door clicked shut, sealing out the freezing draft. I stood in the quiet foyer for a moment before walking slowly into the darkened, formal living room. I didn't bother with the lights. Instead, I moved toward the massive bay windows overlooking the circular driveway and the wrought iron gates of my estate. The private security vehicles and police cruisers idled near the entrance, casting rhythmic, frantic flashes of red and blue across the frost-covered lawns. The sheer chaos unfolding on that driveway was a masterpiece I had waited 10 years to witness. I crossed my arms and watched the payoff play out in real time. Richard paced aggressively beside his sleek black sedan. The security guards had refused to open the main gate until the police finished their incident report, leaving him entirely trapped on my property. The normally stoic, untouchable venture capitalist was reduced to a frantic, red-faced mess, screaming into his phone, his free hand gesturing wildly as he tried desperately to reach his corporate attorneys on a holiday night. I could see his shoulders trembling beneath his expensive sweater. The realization that his own firm, Vanguard Equity, was now hopelessly entangled in a federal wire fraud investigation was finally breaking him. His pristine reputation was gone, and catastrophic financial ruin was staring him directly in the face. He leaned against the hood of his car, buried his face in his hands, and shook with what looked unmistakably like terror. Further down the driveway, lit by the harsh glare of a police spotlight, Trey and Amber were tearing into each other. Amber had her arms wrapped protectively around her shivering children, her face contorted in rage, and even through the thick, double-paned glass of my living room windows I could hear the piercing pitch of her voice cutting through the crisp night air. She jabbed her finger violently into Trey's chest, shoving him backward, step by step, toward the frozen rose bushes. Backed into a corner and stripped of all his unearned confidence, Trey finally snapped, throwing his hands up and screaming back at her, his face twisted into ugly desperation. I watched him hurl the ultimate threat, a pathetic attempt to claw back some measure of control over a woman who had only ever loved his bank balance. He demanded a divorce. He pointed toward the gates and called her a parasite, threatening to leave her with nothing. It was the most foolish display of weakness I had ever witnessed. Amber didn't so much as flinch. Instead, she laughed right in his face, a harsh, manic sound carrying clearly across the frozen lawn. She screamed back that she'd have the papers filed by Monday morning, that she was taking full custody of the children, and that she would personally make sure he rotted alone in federal prison. Then she took her kids by the hand and marched toward a waiting rideshare car idling just outside the gate, leaving Trey standing alone in the freezing cold, his mouth hanging open in shock. My parents huddled near the edge of the driveway, looking like two lost, fragile strangers. Diane clutched her expensive coat tight around her shoulders, sobbing uncontrollably. The elegant, domineering matriarch who had spent her entire life orchestrating flawless country club gatherings now wept openly in front of armed police officers and hired security guards. She had finally realized that by blindly backing Trey, she had lost absolutely everything. Her carefully cultivated social standing, her pristine public image, the entire illusion of her perfect family, all reduced to ash under the flashing lights. My father stood beside her, staring blankly at the gravel, a hollow shell of the man who used to dictate the harsh rules of my childhood. Their golden boy's impending bankruptcy meant their own financial ruin, too. They had poured everything into his failing investment firm, and now it was simply gone. Trey stumbled away from the spot where his wife had abandoned him and turned toward our parents, throwing his arms wide, demanding comfort, demanding a solution, demanding to be saved one final time. But for the very first time in his entire life, my parents did not rush forward to shield him. Diane physically turned her back on him, burying her weeping face in her hands. My father simply shook his head, slowly, refusing even to look at his own son. The rejection was absolute. Whatever unbreakable bond this golden family imagined it had shattered into a million irreparable pieces right there on the frozen asphalt. They were destroying each other, consumed entirely by their own greed and their own lies. I stood in the dark and watched the final act of this tragedy play out. There was no sadness in my heart. There was no guilt. There was only a profound, overwhelming sense of peace. The toxic cycle was finally broken. I reached out, took hold of the heavy velvet curtain and pulled it shut, blocking out the flashing lights and closing the door on my past for good. 3 weeks later, the profound silence in my home had become my absolute favorite luxury. The frantic flashing lights of that Thanksgiving night already felt like a distant, chaotic nightmare, entirely disconnected from the reality I was now building. Business, as they say, moves on at the speed of light. My Delaware C Corp, Sienna Holdings, barely registered a blip on its financial radar following the termination of my brother's empty shell vendor contract. I had anticipated the disruption the moment I first suspected Trey was snooping around my home office, months earlier. Within 48 hours of removing him from my property, my attorneys had already activated a contingency contract with a state-of-the-art logistics facility in Pennsylvania. They seamlessly absorbed our production, brought on a highly trained permanent workforce, and immediately optimized the entire supply chain. Our highly publicized Sephora distribution launch happened exactly on schedule. The beauty press praised the brand's flawless execution and our commitment to sustainable packaging, entirely unaware of the multi-million-dollar corporate war that had unfolded just behind the curtain. Our fourth quarter profits surged 40%. While my empire expanded, the illusion my family had clung to so desperately imploded, swiftly, publicly, and brutally. By the second week of December, Vanguard Equity officially called in the $6 million loan. Since the LLC was entirely hollow, holding no capital, no assets of any kind, the private equity firm went straight after the personal guarantees. Trey and Amber filed for Chapter 7 bankruptcy less than 4 days later. Their sprawling custom-built mansion was seized by the bank, and their luxury cars were towed from the driveway in broad daylight, while the neighbors watched from their own manicured lawns. True to her word on my freezing driveway, Amber filed for an emergency divorce, took full custody of the children, and relocated to a small rental apartment across town, cutting every remaining tie to the man who had ruined her life and destroyed her social standing. But bankruptcy turned out to be the least of Trey's problems. The dossier my corporate attorneys had handed to the authorities triggered an unstoppable legal avalanche. Trey was formally indicted on federal charges of wire fraud, forgery, and identity theft. He was out on bail awaiting trial, facing a mandatory minimum sentence of 10 years in federal prison, and he was not going down alone. Richard, the arrogant architect of the entire hostile takeover, found himself caught in the exact trap he had helped construct. The SEC, tipped off by the fraudulent collateral documents Trey had submitted, launched a full-scale investigation into Vanguard Equity. Federal agents raided Richard's corner office in the financial district, seizing his hard drives and freezing his corporate assets under suspicion of systemic bank fraud. The once untouchable venture capitalist was suddenly fighting for his own freedom. His pristine reputation collapsed into a cautionary tale almost overnight, and his elite country club quietly revoked his membership to avoid the scandal. With Trey facing prison and Richard fighting federal indictments, my parents were left standing in the smoking crater of their own greed. They had liquidated a significant portion of their retirement portfolio to bail Trey out of his initial embezzlement scandal, leaving themselves dangerously exposed. When the bank seized his assets, their money vanished right along with his. The financial safety net they had always assumed I would eventually provide was permanently gone. They were staring down their twilight years with a fraction of their former wealth, and the crushing realization that they had sacrificed their only genuinely successful child in order to protect a criminal. That terrifying new reality sparked a relentless campaign of desperation. Every single morning, when I sat down at my kitchen island with my coffee, my blocked caller log was flooded with notifications. Diane and my father left dozens of sprawling, tearful voicemails. Sometimes Diane was weeping uncontrollably, begging for forgiveness, insisting she'd been blinded by a mother's love for her troubled son and pleading with me to just come home so we could heal. Sometimes my father tried bargaining, suggesting we sit down with a mediator to work out a fair financial settlement for the family, still, absurdly, convinced he had any leverage left. They invoked God. They invoked blood. They invoked memories of a childhood we all knew, deep down, had been a miserable, abusive lie. They even tried sending handwritten letters through my corporate lawyers, demanding that I remember my duty to my family. I never listened to a single voicemail. I never opened a single letter. I simply highlighted the growing list of blocked notifications, tapped delete, and watched their desperate pleas vanish. I instructed my legal team to return all mail stamped return to sender. The boundary I established on Thanksgiving was never meant to be a temporary punishment designed to teach anyone a lesson. It was a permanent, impenetrable wall. I had spent 28 years trying to earn a place at a table where I was actively despised. Now I owned the entire estate, the table, and the feast that came with it. I stood up, poured the rest of my coffee into a travel mug, and grabbed my keys. It was a crisp, bright winter morning, and I had a multi-million-dollar empire to run, entirely free from the shadows of the people who had never once believed I could build one. That crisp winter morning set the tone for the rest of the season. By the final week of December, my estate had been completely transformed. The heavy, suffocating atmosphere that had poisoned the dining room that Thanksgiving night was entirely gone, replaced now by the scent of fresh pine, roasted chestnuts, and genuine, uninhibited laughter. I was hosting my very first annual Christmas Eve gala, and for the first time in my life, I was actually looking forward to a holiday dinner. I walked through the grand foyer, the same space where my parents had once scrambled tearfully for their coats under the glare of police lights barely a month earlier. Tonight, the marble floors echoed instead, with the cheerful chatter of 50 guests. But this was not a gathering of blood relatives bound together by toxic obligation. This was my chosen family. I stood near the edge of the living room, nursing a glass of sparkling cider, and watched the people who actually mattered. Over by the roaring fireplace, my lead organic chemist, Sarah, was animatedly explaining a new peptide extraction method to my old college business law professor. The same man who had first handed me a book on corporate structures 10 years earlier, back when I was a desperate teenager searching for any kind of lifeline. Across the room, my logistics director traded jokes with the marketing team, their easy camaraderie a stark contrast to the cutthroat, backstabbing environment Trey had always cultivated at his failing investment firm. These were the people who had stayed late in a cramped, poorly ventilated laboratory during the earliest days of Sienna Botanicals. These were the mentors who had picked up my panicked calls at 2 a.m. while I tried to navigate my very first major retail contract. They were the friends who celebrated my victories without a shred of jealousy and stood by me through every setback without a whisper of judgment. Together, we had built an empire brick by brick, formula by formula, on a foundation of mutual respect and absolute trust. A gentle clink of a spoon against crystal drew everyone's attention to the center of the room. Sarah raised her champagne glass, a bright, genuine smile lighting up her face. She didn't offer some forced, passive-aggressive toast about family duty the way my mother always had. Instead, she spoke about resilience, about the late nights, the impossible deadlines, and the unwavering vision that had brought all of us to this beautiful home. When she raised her glass toward me and called me the bravest CEO she had ever known, the room erupted into warm, heartfelt applause. A sudden, overwhelming warmth bloomed in my chest, a sensation I had never once experienced during any holiday spent with my biological family. I excused myself from the crowd and stepped quietly into the adjoining library, pulling the heavy oak doors shut behind me. The sudden quiet offered a moment of real clarity. I crossed to the tall windows and looked out over the frost-covered driveway, the very spot where my family had violently imploded, now lined instead with the cars of people who genuinely valued me. For 28 years I had carried an invisible, crushing weight on my shoulders. I had twisted myself into endless shapes trying to be the perfect, compliant daughter, hoping that someday my parents would look at me with even a fraction of the blind adoration they reserved for Trey. I had internalized their constant criticism, mistaking their cruelty for ordinary family dynamics. But shedding that weight had fundamentally changed my life. Standing there in the quiet elegance of my library, I realized I could finally breathe. I was no longer bracing for the next insult, the next demand for money, the next manipulative guilt trip. My posture was straighter. My mind was clearer. The low, constant anxiety that used to seize me every time my phone rang had simply evaporated. I had learned the hardest lesson of all. Blood only dictates who brought you into this world. It does not dictate who belongs in your life. Real family is not an automatic birthright that grants people permission to abuse you, use you, and discard you the moment you become inconvenient. Real family is an active, daily choice. It is the people who defend your peace, who celebrate your independence, and who love you for exactly who you are, not for what they can extract from you. I took a deep breath, letting the clean winter air fill my lungs, and turned away from the window. The past was locked permanently outside those gates, freezing in the dark. I opened the library doors and stepped back into the warm light, ready to celebrate the beautiful, unbreakable family I had chosen for myself. The rest of the evening dissolved into a beautiful blur of laughter, clinking glasses, and genuine connection. By the time the last guest hugged me goodbye and the heavy front doors finally closed, it was well past midnight. The house went quiet again, but this time it was a warm, comforting kind of silence. I walked back into the living room, kicked off my heels, and sank into the plush velvet armchair beside the dying embers of the fireplace. The glowing coals made the perfect backdrop for my final reflections on the storm I had just weathered. People often misunderstand the true nature of vengeance. Pop culture conditions us to believe revenge has to be loud, a dramatic spectacle, screaming matches, thrown punches, an active campaign to destroy someone else's life. But that kind of vengeance is inherently flawed. It requires you to lower yourself to the exact level of your abusers. It keeps your energy tethered to the very people who hurt you, draining your spirit long after the initial conflict has ended. What I learned over the past 10 years is that the most effective, most devastating form of revenge is entirely silent. It is structural. True revenge is simply stepping aside and letting arrogant people sign their own destruction with the pen of their own bottomless greed. Trey and Richard didn't lose their mansions, their reputations, and their freedom because I actively plotted their ruin. I simply built an impenetrable fortress around my own hard work and refused, finally, to be their sacrificial lamb. I stopped catching them every time they fell. Their monumental entitlement was their own undoing. They looked at me and saw a vulnerable, inferior woman running a little skincare hobby. Their staggering hubris blinded them completely to the legal landmines they were gleefully tap dancing across. When you're dealing with narcissists and lifelong parasites, you don't need to orchestrate their downfall yourself. You only need to meticulously document their actions, secure your own borders, and let the unforgiving law of natural consequences take the wheel. There was, however, one final loose end I needed to tie up. A microscopic detail, but a deeply symbolic one, necessary to close this chapter for good. Years earlier, long before the Delaware C Corp, before the Sephora contracts, before any of the multi-million-dollar valuations, I had gone through a brief stretch of genuine financial vulnerability. I needed capital to secure my very first bulk order of botanical ingredients, and I made the mistake of asking my family for a standard business loan. My parents laughed in my face, but Richard, always eager to play the benevolent patriarch, handed me a check for $5,000. He made sure to do it loudly, publicly, calling it pity money, framing it explicitly as a charitable donation meant to keep me from embarrassing the family name. He never asked for equity, writing it off as the cheap cost of maintaining his own superiority complex. He had, without question, forgotten all about that minor transaction long ago. I never forgot. I kept my internal ledger perfectly balanced. The week after Trey's federal indictment became public knowledge, I made a trip to my private bank, sat down across from my wealth manager, and requested a certified cashier's check made out to Richard for exactly $5,000. I carried the crisp, watermarked check back to my home office, slid it inside a heavy white envelope, and left out any note detailing my success or rubbing salt into his fresh wounds. I simply took a piece of premium cardstock and wrote 3 words in sharp black ink. Paid in full. I left no return address. I paid a private courier to hand-deliver it directly to the cramped temporary rental office Richard had been forced into after federal agents seized his luxurious headquarters. I never needed to see his face when he opened it. The mental image alone was satisfying enough, a once untouchable financial titan, drowning in a federal bank fraud investigation, watching his legacy evaporate, receiving a perfectly legal, utterly dismissive refund from the very woman he had tried to destroy. Sending it back was never about the money. It was about cleanly severing the very last string they believed still connected them to my life. It was the ultimate declaration of my absolute independence. As the final embers faded to ash, I looked around the expansive, peaceful space of my home. The trauma of being the family scapegoat is a ghost story I no longer have to tell. I am the sole architect of my own reality now. So for anyone out there who feels trapped beneath the toxic weight of family expectations, remember this: you do not owe your future to people who only value you for what they can extract from you. Build your fortress in total silence. Protect your peace fiercely. And let their own arrogance become the architect of their final undoing. Now I want to turn this conversation over to you. Sitting here and sharing my story hasn't just been about exposing the toxic dynamics of my past or reliving one dramatic Thanksgiving dinner. It has been about reaching anyone out there who might be sitting at their own version of that table right now, feeling completely trapped, chronically undervalued, and hopelessly alone. I know exactly how heavy that isolation feels sitting in your chest. I know the paralyzing fear that comes with believing that if you finally stand up for yourself, you'll lose the only family you've ever known. But as you've seen from the arc of my own life, sometimes losing that toxic, draining connection is the exact catalyst you need to finally find yourself. So I want to ask you something important. Have you ever watched someone's own greed become their trap? Have you ever found yourself in a situation where simply holding your ground and refusing to play the helpless victim allowed a manipulator to expose their true colors to the world? It takes an incredible amount of restraint to stay silent while you're being unjustly attacked. It takes real emotional discipline not to scream your truth from the rooftops while people are actively plotting against your success. But there is a profound, undeniable power in stepping back, securing your boundaries, and letting other people's reckless entitlement do all the heavy lifting for you. If you've ever experienced that quiet, definitive kind of victory, I would genuinely love to read about it. Or maybe your story resonates more with the painful reality of having to walk away from the very people who were supposed to protect you. Cutting ties with biological family is never a decision made lightly, no matter how justified it is. Society constantly pressures us to forgive and forget, feeding us the tired narrative that blood is always thicker than water. But nobody ever talks about the profound grief of mourning the parents or siblings you deserved, long before you actually had to cut them out of your life. Walking away requires you to mourn the illusion of a family that never really existed in the first place. It's a heartbreaking, exhausting process, but it is also one of the most liberating steps you will ever take toward your own healing. If you've had to make that agonizing choice, if you've had to pack your bags and leave behind people who should have been your safest harbor, please share your experience in the comments below. Your stories matter more than you probably realize. When you write them out, you're not just venting into some digital void, you're building a community. You're showing someone else, scrolling through these comments in the middle of a sleepless, anxiety-filled night, that they are not crazy, that they are not broken, and that they are absolutely not alone. Being labeled the black sheep of a family is rarely ever about doing something wrong. It's almost always about seeing straight through the dysfunction and refusing to play your assigned role. The comment section under this video is a safe space for the scapegoats, the black sheep, and the cycle breakers. We're the ones who refuse to inherit generational trauma, and we're the ones building healthier, happier lives entirely on our own terms. If this journey resonated with you, if you found any strength, validation, or comfort in my words today, please hit the like button. It helps push this message out to a wider audience, out to the people who might desperately need a reminder of their own power right now. Make sure to subscribe to the channel so we can keep having these honest, unfiltered conversations about boundary setting, overcoming narcissistic family abuse, and building real financial and emotional independence. I have so many more insights, business strategies, and personal lessons still to share with all of you. And please, share this video with a friend, a coworker, or anyone you know who might be quietly struggling with a toxic dynamic of their own. Sometimes, simply hearing that someone else survived the exact same nightmare is the key that unlocks the door to their own freedom. Thank you so much for spending your time with me today. Thank you for listening to my truth, and thank you for being part of this incredible, growing, chosen family. Remember that your worth is not defined by people who are biologically incapable of seeing it. Your value is not determined by how much you're willing to sacrifice for those who refuse to appreciate you. You are entirely whole, entirely capable, and entirely deserving of a life filled with genuine respect and unconditional support. Keep building your fortress. Keep guarding your energy. Never apologize for protecting your peace, and never let anyone talk you into lowering your drawbridge for a wolf in sheep's clothing. Stay strong, trust your intuition, and I will see you all in the next video.